The stench announced the horror long before the screaming did. A thick, sweet, sickly odour that drifted through Victorian streets like a warning no one wanted to heed. In the cramped tenements of London and the factory towns beyond, a simple cut could turn traitor. A blister from a boot, a scrape from a workbench, a child's torn skin on a rusted nail, all of it could blacken overnight, the flesh shriveling, dying, and falling away as if the body were being eaten alive from the inside. Doctors arrived with polished bags and trembling hands, for gangrene was the disease they feared most. By the time the pain faded into numbness, the real terror had already begun. Rooms filled with the sour perfume of rotting flesh. Surgeons whispered the word amputation under candlelight, while families braced themselves for the sound of the bone saw. And in a world without antibiotics, even the wealthy prayed that death would arrive slower than the rot. This is the nightmare Victorians tried desperately to hide the disease that devoured them limb by limb. Stay with us, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. There are darker truths ahead than you may be prepared to face. The trouble began with something so small, no one in the household thought to remember it. A thin, red line along the palm of Thomas Barrow, a factory labourer whose hands were always marked by scrapes and soot and the daily insults of metal and steam. It happened in the dim half-light of early morning, when the factory bell rang like a commandment and men hurried through the fog with collars lifted against the damp. A splinter of iron from a machine casing had caught his skin as he reached to steady a shuddering gear. A sting, a hissed breath, a muttered curse, and the day went on. For men like Thomas, pain was as common as coal dust. What was one more scratch? He rinsed the line of blood at the pump outside the workshop, watching the faint pink swirl away into the gutter. The water was cold, metallic, tinged with the grime of 100 hands before his. He wiped his palm on his trousers, leaving a dull smear behind, and went back inside to the machine's roar. No one noticed the faint swelling that formed by dusk. Not Thomas, not his wife who set supper on the table without looking too closely, and not the children who clambered into his lap before bed, delighted just to have him home. It was only the next morning that the house began to smell wrong. At first it was faint, a sweetness that did not belong in a labourer's cottage, drifting through the kitchen as his wife stirred the porridge. She lifted the lid from the pot, sniffed, frowned, and blamed the milk. But the odour thickened as the morning wore on, clinging to the walls, settling into the folds of their clothing like a perfume designed by some cruel apothecary. When Thomas came down the stairs, pale and sweating, she finally understood the smell was following him. His hand had swollen grotesquely overnight, the thin scratch now a dark, angry line running up his forearm. The skin felt hot, tight, and tender, though he insisted it was only a passing irritation, a bit of inflammation, as men like to call the beginnings of something much worse. But the edges of the wound had begun to soften, turning grey around the scar, the texture of fruit left too long in a cellar. When he pressed the area gently, he felt something shift beneath the skin, a softness that did not belong inside a living body. By noon, he could no longer bend his fingers. Neighbours urged him to seek the doctor, though the word hung heavy. Doctors were expensive. Surgeons were worse. And Thomas, like many proud men in the slums, believed himself too resilient, too stubborn, too alive to be undone by a mere scratch. But as he sat at the table, staring at his mottled hand, a dizziness swept over him, and beads of sweat rolled down his temple. His wife touched his forehead and recoiled. His skin was cold despite the fever burning inside him. The doctor arrived by candlelight, a thin man with a polished bag and a face carved by long familiarity with suffering. He paused at the doorway the moment the smell reached him. Everyone paused when they first recognized it. The sickly sweet scent of decay, delicate and horrifying, like flowers wilting in a sealed room. He approached Thomas slowly, his breath held, his eyes narrowing as he peeled back the linen cloth wrapped around the injured hand. What lay beneath did not look like a wound. It looked like the beginning of a disappearance. The edges of flesh were turning the color of tobacco ash, the skin breaking easily at the touch. A coldness radiated upward, creeping along the veins like a shadow trying to claim the arm inch by inch. The doctor said nothing for a long moment. He simply gazed, lips pressed tightly together, knowing precisely what he was seeing and wishing he did not have to say it aloud. When he finally spoke, the candle flickered, or perhaps his voice shook. "This," he murmured, "should have healed. It should have been nothing, but it is not nothing. The rot is inside him now." And in the stillness of that narrow room, the family understood a tiny scratch had become the first whisper of the death that ate men alive. By the next morning, the odor had settled into the cottage so thoroughly that even the wallpaper seemed to exhale it. It clung to the curtains, seeped into the mattress, and hovered above the floor like a pale, invisible fog. No matter how wide Thomas's wife opened the windows, no matter how fiercely the winter wind pushed into the room, the sweetness remained stubborn, unnatural, and far too alive. It was the kind of scent that belonged to neither the living nor the dead, but to something caught between the two. Thomas lay beneath the bedclothes, shivering despite the fire burning low in the grate. His breath came in uneven bursts, and at times his eyes wandered aimlessly as though following something only he could see. The wound on his hand, if one could still call it a wound, had darkened further. The flesh was no longer merely swollen, it had begun to collapse inward, softening like damp parchment. His fingers, once capable of guiding spinning gears and lifting his children effortlessly, now curled stiffly against the sheets. His wife hovered at the bedside, torn between fear and denial. She had noticed the smell before dawn, drifting up the stairs like a guest uninvited. At first, she thought it might be the chimney, some foul air dislodged by the frost. But as she drew nearer to Thomas, as she lifted the coverlet to check his fever, the truth pressed against her face like a rotten blossom. The scent was strongest here beneath the bedclothes, where warm darkness nurtured whatever horror had taken hold of his flesh. She tried to mask it with vinegar. She boiled lavender and set it by the bedside. She pressed her apron to her face when she looked at his hand. Nothing helped. Nothing could outcompete the unmistakable perfume of decay. By mid-morning, the children refused to enter the room. They lingered at the doorway, wide-eyed, whispering as though their father had become someone else, as though the smell meant he was slipping away from them. A neighbor who stopped by with bread stepped over the threshold, inhaled once, and froze. Her face blanched, and she backed away as though the fragrance itself could crawl across the floorboards. "It smells like," she began, but her voice faltered, unwilling to finish the sentence. The doctor returned shortly after noon, summoned by a frantic knock at his door. He arrived with his coat still unbuttoned, his spectacles fogging with each breath in the bitter cold. As he stepped into the bedroom, he paused again, the way doctors often did when their senses recognized the patient's fate, before their mind dared admit it. He set his bag on the table, but did not open it yet. Instead, he lifted the bedclothes slowly, as though uncovering a relic or a corpse. The smell intensified instantly, blooming into the air like some perverse flower. It was rich, wet, and cloying a sweetness that had nothing to do with sugar or fruit, but with tissue surrendering its life, cell by cell. Thomas's hand lay motionless on the linen. The skin around the wound had begun to separate from the muscle beneath, forming thin, shadowed pockets filled with a murky fluid. When the doctor touched the edge gently, the tissue gave way, sloughing off with a whisper of softness that no living flesh should ever possess. Thomas did not cry out. He did not flinch. His lack of reaction chilled the room more than any winter wind. Numbness, the doctor knew, was the truest sign of disaster. He leaned closer, his face tightening in quiet dread. Gangrene had begun its work in earnest. The line of discoloration creeping along Thomas's wrist was no longer merely dark. It had taken on a sheen, a faint iridescence, as though the flesh itself were fermenting. Small bubbles formed beneath the skin, rising and settling with each heartbeat. The doctor exhaled, long and weary. "He cannot stay here," he said at last. "Not with the children, not with the air so still around him. This sweet smell means the flesh is dying faster than I feared." Thomas's wife pressed her apron to her mouth to stifle a sob. The doctor closed his eyes briefly, gathering the words he wished he did not have to speak. "We must act soon, very soon, before the rot outruns us." Beneath the bedclothes, the sweetness thickened a scent that marked the quiet beginning of a war between the living body and the encroaching darkness beneath its skin. The doctor returned the following morning, though not without a moment of stillness on the threshold, a hesitation that betrayed what his profession would not allow him to say. He stood before the cottage door with his gloved hand raised, listening to the faint crackle of the hearth inside, the murmur of children kept deliberately quiet, and, beneath it all, the scent drifting outward in thin, nauseating threads. Sweetness again, but thicker now, richer, as though the night had ripened it. He knew that smell too well. Every surgeon of the age knew it. It was the calling card of death, arriving ahead of schedule. When he finally stepped inside, he removed his hat slowly, respectfully, as though entering a chamber of mourning rather than a home. The wife met him in the narrow hallway, her eyes rimmed red, her posture stiff from a night without sleep. She said nothing at first, only lifted her chin slightly toward the stairs. The doctor understood. The illness had climbed higher with the dawn. He ascended step by step, his boots creaking on the boards. With each footfall, the sweetness grew heavier, as if it were a mist he was wading through rather than a smell carried on the air. By the time he reached the bedroom landing, his breath had grown shallow. Not from fear, physicians were trained to silence fear, but from the body's instinctive recoil from the presence of decomposition. He paused at the bedroom door, his hand resting on the frame. A doctor hesitates only when two things are true. The case is already lost, and he must still pretend it is not. Inside, Thomas lay sprawled across the sheets, his body twisted by fever. Sweat gleamed along his hairline, and the color had drained from his cheeks, leaving him waxen, as though the night had leached something essential from him. His eyes fluttered open at the doctor's approach, but there was no recognition in them, only fog, the kind that settles over a mind drifting toward delirium. The doctor leaned close, lifting the bedclothes again. His fingers worked carefully, almost tenderly, though his expression hardened. The hand and forearm, once merely discolored, now looked like something carved from charcoal. The skin had tightened around the wrist into a dark, glossy band. Further up the arm, faint marbling spiraled beneath the surface, purples, greens, greys like bruises blooming without touch. The doctor did not speak for a long moment. Silence hung between them, broken only by Thomas's labored breathing. "Finally," he murmured, "this has progressed." Progressed was the word physicians used when they meant worsened beyond mercy. He reached into his bag with slow deliberation, withdrawing a long linen roll. Instruments clinked softly within it. The wife's breath caught. She recognized the sound, as every woman of the slums eventually learned to do. Metal meant decisions no family wanted to face. "We must discuss what can be done," the doctor said quietly, "and what cannot." Thomas stirred, his gaze momentarily sharpening. "Will it come off?" His voice cracked on the final words, as though they had splintered his resolve. The doctor did not answer immediately. Instead, he examined the arm again, pressing 2 fingers along the cold, mottled skin. There was no reaction, no twitch, no pain. The limb might as well have belonged to someone already dead. At last, with great reluctance, he spoke. "If we remove it, there is a chance, a small one, that the rot might not spread further. He paused. "If we do nothing, the infection will climb. It will reach places that cannot be cut away." The wife pressed her sleeve to her mouth. The children, listening from the hall, stifled their cries. "And if we cut," Thomas whispered. The doctor let out a long, steadying breath. "The operation is dangerous. Your body is weak. You may not survive it, but without it," his voice softened to a thread, "without it the disease will take you in days." He rolled the instrument slowly, deliberately, letting the polished steel catch the thin winter light that filtered through the curtains. Not as a threat, but as a truth. Thomas closed his eyes. Sweat beaded along his brow. His wife reached for his uninjured hand, gripping it as though anchoring him to the living world. The doctor remained still, watching them, his expression carved with regret, for he knew what the choice would cost, whichever way it fell. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane. Inside, the sweetness thickened in the air, as though the room itself was breathing in time with the dying limb. And at the doorway, the doctor stood motionless, a man caught between duty and dread, knowing he would cross this threshold again before the day was through. In another corner of the same soot-stained neighborhood, where the alleys narrowed into crooked passageways and the fog curled around lampposts like a living thing, a different story of rot was beginning to unfold, smaller in size, quieter in tone, but no less ominous. It started with a child's shoe. A tiny leather boot, scuffed at the toe and stiff from second-hand wear, pinched the foot of 7-year-old Clara Wells as she hurried along the cobblestones to fetch coal for her mother's stove. Children's injuries rarely caused alarm in such districts. Scrapes, bruises, and crushed toes were accepted as the toll of growing up beneath the smokestacks. But Clara, slipping on a patch of frozen slush, stubbed her foot hard against a stone. She winced, shook out her leg, and continued on. The pain was sharp, but fleeting. She did not mention it when she returned home, nor did her mother notice the small tear in the leather, or the faint drop of blood that blossomed through her sock. By nightfall, Clara complained that her toe throbbed. Her mother, exhausted from laundry work that kept her hands cracked and raw, dabbed it with a bit of cold water and wrapped it in cloth. "It will be better by morning, love," she whispered, brushing Clara's hair from her forehead. Children healed quickly. Everyone in the neighborhood believed that. Resilience was their inheritance. But morning brought something else entirely. Clara limped to the hearth with her foot tucked beneath her nightdress, moving slowly, delicately, as though her balance had been tampered with. When she finally allowed her mother to examine the injury, what she revealed made the woman's breath catch. The small toe had turned a dusky shade of violet, the color creeping downward from the nail. The skin around it was swollen, glossy, tight, as though the flesh beneath was struggling to escape. Clara winced when the cloth touched it, but oddly, only for a moment. Then her eyes widened with confusion. "It doesn't hurt now," she whispered. "It feels funny." No mother in Victorian London needed a physician's education to know that numbness was not a blessing, not when it followed such ominous discoloration. Panic prickled along her spine, though she tried to keep her voice steady. She warmed the room, prepared tea, pressed her palm to Clara's forehead, but none of it comforted her. The girl's skin had grown cool despite the fire, and a faint, unfamiliar scent clung to the bandage, barely perceptible, but present a ghost of sweetness. She sent her eldest son running for the doctor. By the time he arrived, the house had grown tense with silence. Clara sat in her mother's lap, blinking drowsily, unaware that the air around her had shifted into something heavy with dread. The doctor knelt beside her and unraveled the cloth with practiced precision. He did not need to touch the toe to know trouble had taken root. The blackness had begun to bloom beneath the nail, spreading like ink through paper. A thin line traced upward along the soft skin of the foot, faint but unmistakable. The mother spoke first. "Is it infection?" Her voice trembled, though she tried to disguise it with firmness. In part, the doctor murmured, examining the foot under the lamplight. But more than that, the circulation has failed. The flesh is beginning to die. The word beginning held the darkest weight. Clara looked between them, confused by their expressions. She did not feel ill, only strangely light, as though the injured foot were no longer truly hers. The doctor straightened slowly. His face was drawn, shadowed by the realization settling over him. 2 patients in one district, both showing early stages of the same terrible affliction, one from a cut, another from a child's stumble. Rot was moving through the neighborhood like a silent traveler. He lowered his voice and placed a hand on the mother's shoulder. You must keep her warm. Watch her closely, and pray the discoloration halts. If it spreads. He hesitated, unwilling to speak of amputations before the ears of a child. The mother nodded, gripping Clara tightly, as though her arms alone could hold death at bay. Outside, the fog thickened around the street lamps. Inside, a faint sweetness lingered in the room, the earliest whisper of a danger no family wished to name. And somewhere not far away, the doctor's mind tallied the cases, his dread deepening. Gangrene was not choosing victims by injury or age. It was choosing them by proximity. The rot had begun to nest in the district, and the blackened toe of a little girl was its quiet announcement. The riverbank behind the tenements steamed faintly each morning, even in winter, as if exhaling the worries of the neighborhood along with the mist. Here the washerwomen gathered before dawn, their skirts damp to the knees, their fingers already numb from soaking linens in the icy water. Among them was Mrs. Hargreaves, a woman whose life had been measured out in soap flakes, boiling kettles, and the quiet ache of work that never ended. Her hands had always borne the proof. Cracked knuckles, reddened palms, and small wounds that opened as predictably as the tide. Yet on this particular morning, as she scrubbed a collar against the washboard, she paused. A sudden sting shot through her right hand, sharp enough to make her gasp. She looked down to find a gash she did not remember earning, a thin slice running diagonally across her palm. It bled freely, the crimson mixing with the sudsy water, swirling away in pink clouds. She frowned but did not stop. Washerwomen could not afford to stop. She wrapped the wound with a scrap of muslin and plunged her arms back into the basin. By afternoon, the pain had deepened into a throbbing pulse. She flexed her fingers, wincing as the swelling tightened across her knuckles. When she returned home, exhausted and chilled to the bone, she unwound the cloth to find the skin around the wound pale and puffy, as though the water had soaked into her flesh rather than her laundry. She dabbed it with vinegar and tied on a fresh bandage, telling herself it was nothing, just another day's injury, nothing more. But by the next morning, the nothing had begun to change. Her palm had grown warm, almost feverishly so, and the skin took on a waxy sheen. A faint odor drifted from the bandage. She ignored it at first, attributing it to damp cloth or spoiled soap. But as she scrubbed the day's linens, her hands trembling from the effort, she noticed something chilling. Her fingers no longer hurt. They did not feel anything at all. Alarm crept through her chest like a rising tide. She pressed the wound gently, expecting pain, but felt only a dull pressure, as though touching something that did not belong to her. The numbness spread slowly upward, swallowing sensation as it went. She tried to continue working, but the cloth slipped from her grasp. Her fingers would not tighten. They hung useless, stiffening by the minute. The other washerwomen exchanged wary glances. They recognized the smell, now faint, sweet, uncanny. One of them whispered a prayer. Another urged her to seek help. But Mrs. Hargreaves, stubborn as the river current she worked beside, insisted she was fine. "It's the cold," she muttered. "It's nothing the Lord won't mend." Yet when she reached home that evening, the truth confronted her beneath the lamplight. The wound had darkened. A dusky green shadow crept along her palm, inching toward her wrist. The edges of the flesh had softened, sinking inward as if collapsing under its own decay. Her husband recoiled when she unwrapped the cloth. Her youngest child burst into tears. The smell grew stronger in the close air of the cottage, mingling with the scent of cooking broth, until neither could be separated from the other. A knock came at the door an hour later, the same doctor who had been called for Thomas Barrow and young Clara Wells. He stepped inside, his face grim as he examined her hand. The signs were unmistakable. 3 cases in one district. 3 victims of wounds that should have healed but instead welcomed rot like a guest at supper. "This infection spreads quickly," he said quietly, lowering her hand back into her lap, "and it will not stop on its own." Mrs. Hargreaves swallowed hard. "Will I lose the hand?" The doctor hesitated, the hesitation that had become his constant companion these past days. "If we act soon," he answered, "we may save your life." He did not say the rest, that the hand itself was already lost. She looked down at her fingers, the same fingers that had washed clothes for the entire neighborhood, that had braided her daughter's hair, that had mended shirts and soothed fevers, and held infants close. Now they lay motionless, foreign, already drifting toward death. And as the lamplight flickered across her darkening skin, she understood what the doctor would not yet speak aloud. Gangrene had found her, too. Night came early to the neighborhood that winter, settling over the rooftops like a heavy wool shroud. Inside the small cottages, candles were lit not for comfort but out of necessity. The fog outside pressed too thickly against the windows for lamplight alone to pierce. In one such dimly glowing room, the doctor prepared for another examination, this time of 3 patients, all afflicted by the same creeping horror. He set his medical bag on the table with a soft thud, the metal clasps glinting faintly in the flickering light. The room smelled of wax and fear. The washerwoman's husband stood by the hearth, arms folded tightly across his chest, as if bracing himself against something he could neither see nor fight. The children had been sent to a neighbor's home. Their shadows still clung to the air, as though their worry lingered in their absence. Mrs. Hargreaves herself sat in a straight-backed chair, her injured hand resting on a folded cloth. She kept her eyes fixed on the candle flame, refusing to look down at the limb she no longer recognized as her own. The doctor approached slowly, his footsteps careful, the floorboards creaking beneath him like old bones. "Let us begin," he murmured, though his voice carried little reassurance. He untied the cloth with deliberate care. As the fabric fell away, the sweet, nauseating scent rose sharply, filling the room in an instant. The washerwoman's husband stepped back involuntarily. Even the flame seemed to waver, as if disturbed by a gust of rot. Beneath the cloth, the hand lay swollen and darkened, its surface mottled with greenish patches that glistened unnaturally beneath the warm candlelight. The wound itself had widened, the edges curling like burnt paper. The doctor leaned closer, lips pressed into a thin, troubled line. He touched the skin gently with the back of his finger. It yielded too easily. Flesh should resist. This flesh did not. "Tell me," he said softly, "can you feel this?" Mrs. Hargreaves glanced down only briefly, then away again. "No," she whispered. "Nothing at all." He nodded grimly. "The numbness has reached the wrist." She swallowed. "What does that mean?" He hesitated, just as he had at Thomas Barrow's bedside and at Clara Wells's kitchen table. "It means the tissue is dying faster than we can intervene. The rot is spreading beneath the skin, and sensation cannot return to that which no longer lives." Her breath hitched, but she remained composed, the kind of composure only women accustomed to suffering could maintain. She did not weep. She simply stared harder at the candle's flame, as though willing herself not to hear what she knew must come next. The doctor opened his bag, the faint clink of tools cutting through the silence like distant thunder. He laid out a saw, forceps, scissors, bandages, and a bottle of ether, whose scent sharp enough to sting the senses. These were instruments of salvation, yet in the eyes of most, they looked more like instruments of loss. "We have a narrow window," he said carefully. "To save your life, we may need to remove the hand, perhaps more." He breathed out slowly. "If the gangrene travels further, no operation in the world will be enough." Her husband stepped forward, voice trembling. "She cannot go through that." "She must," the doctor replied, "if she wants to see another month." Silence fell again, thicker than before. The washerwoman's gaze dropped at last to the hand in her lap, the same hand that had scrubbed linens along the riverbank that very morning. Now it was turning grey at the fingertips, the nails lifting slightly from the darkening skin. "I need time," she whispered. "There is very little," the doctor answered, "though I will give you what I can." He rewrapped the hand gently, with the tenderness one might give to a dying bird. The candle guttered at that moment, and for a heartbeat the room dimmed, as if the shadows had grown bold enough to reach forward. As he packed his instruments away, the doctor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. 3 cases, 3 different wounds, same result. Something was moving among the people, not a creature, not a poison, but a perfect storm of filth, injury, and unseen forces that turned small harms into fatal ones. When he stepped out into the night, the fog swallowed him instantly. Behind him, inside the flickering cottage, the sweet scent of decay continued to rise, as though the candlelight itself were feeding it. The workhouse, with its long stone corridors and echoing chambers, had always been a place where whispers travelled faster than footsteps. Every cough, every quarrel, every misfortune rippled through its halls like a draught slipping under a door. But in recent days, the murmurs had taken on a different character, softer, more urgent, tinged with something sour and fearful. It was not hunger they spoke of now, nor the cruelty of overseers, nor the monotony of labour. It was the smell. The first to mention it was a boy who swept the corridors at dawn, his broom scratching across the flagstones in the half-light. He claimed the air near the infirmary had turned sweet-like, as though fruit had gone bad beneath the floorboards. No one listened at first. The boy was known for his imagination. But by midday, the nurses had begun to notice it too, a faint, cloying scent that drifted through the passages like a slow-moving fog. Then came the stories. A man in Ward 3 who lost the use of his hand overnight. A girl who limped in with a blister and by morning could no longer feel her foot. A washerwoman sent from the tenements, her hand wrapped in cloth, smelling of something that made the nurses step back without meaning to. Rumours grew as easily as mould in the damp corners of the building. Some said a poison had entered the water. Others claimed it was an airborne disease, creeping through the windows with the fog. A few whispered about curses, or retribution, or spirits restless from the graveyard behind the workhouse. But most spoke only of the smell, that unmistakable sweetness that had no business in a place built from stone and sorrow. In the dim-lit laundry room, where steam rose in ghostly coils and the air was thick with damp linen, the women spoke in hushed tones over the clatter of tubs. "It starts with a scratch," one said, wringing out a shirt with trembling fingers. "Or a shoe rubbing your heel raw," added another. "And then the smell comes," a third whispered, glancing toward the door as if the scent itself might be listening. At the far end of the corridor, the overseer walked with heavy steps, though even he could not ignore the atmosphere of unease, settling like dust across the floors. The workhouse master, a stern man who prided himself on order and discipline, grew increasingly irritated by the murmurs. "Infection," he snapped when questioned. Nothing more than infection brought in by the poor hygiene of the lower districts. But even he did not linger near the infirmary. Inside that sombre chamber, 7 beds were occupied. The patients lay beneath thin blankets, their faces pale, their breaths shallow. The nurse on duty moved between them with steady hands, but her eyes betrayed the tension beneath her professionalism. She kept her apron close to her mouth, as though trying to filter the sweetness that thickened the air with every passing hour. She paused at the bedside of a young man, barely 20, who had arrived 2 nights prior with a wound from a factory machine. When she lifted the bandage, a faint gasp escaped her lips. The flesh had darkened further. The wound pulsed faintly, as though something beneath the skin were breathing. She covered it quickly, her pulse quickening. The rumors were true. By evening, the corridors hummed with tremors of dread. Workers leaned close to one another, whispering tales half overheard and half imagined. They say it eats the flesh. They say you cannot feel it until it's too late. They say if you smell sweetness, someone nearby is already dying. The workhouse bell tolled 7 times as dusk settled outside, its clang echoing through the halls like a warning from some ancient clock. The fog pressed at the windows, heavy and thick, as though eager to seep inside. And above all the murmurs, beneath every cautious step, the sweetness lingered, subtle yet unmistakable. A quiet reminder that something unseen had begun to walk the corridors with them, filling the air with its perfumed breath. Rumors, in such places, became truth long before the doctor arrived, and by the end of the night, the workhouse knew. Gangrene had found its way inside. In the heart of the narrow high street, where the fog pressed itself against shop windows like a curious animal, stood Mr. Winton's apothecary, a cramped room of polished wood, amber-glassed bottles, and the quiet desperation of those who sought cures they could not afford. For years, Mr. Winton had been a steady figure in the neighborhood, a man with silver-framed spectacles, careful hands, and a reputation for crafting remedies that soothed more fears than fevers. His shelves brimmed with tinctures, powders, and patent medicines promising to chase away every ill known to Victorian London. But nothing on those shelves prepared him for the past week. It began with Thomas Barrow's wife arriving at his counter, clutching a handkerchief that reeked faintly of sweetness, the same sweetness that now haunted the doctor's rounds, the workhouse corridors, and the very air of the district. Her request had been simple, desperate, something to stop it spreading. She did not name the "it" for naming. It made the threat too real. Mr. Winton mixed her a tonic of laudanum and camphor, adding a few drops of his strongest antiseptic. He corked the bottle tightly, praying the fumes alone might chase away the rot. But the next day she returned, her face pale, her hands shaking. "It hasn't slowed," she whispered. "It's as though the flesh refuses to listen." Soon after came another woman, the mother of the little girl with the darkening toe. Then a man from the workhouse infirmary. Then 2 more whose bandages carried that same uncanny perfume of decay. Each one begged for help, for anything that might halt the creeping death taking hold of their limbs. By the 4th such visitor, Mr. Winton's stomach knotted with dread. He rummaged through his cabinets, pulling out herbs reserved for rare afflictions, wormwood, gentian, oil of turpentine. He brewed mixtures of increasing potency, stirring them with shaking hands. The candles around him flickered, as though recoiling from the vapors rising from his mortar. On the evening of the 3rd day, he summoned his assistant, a thin young man named Edgar, whose apprenticeship had once been filled with quiet curiosity but now trembled under the weight of fear. "Fetch the medical manual," Mr. Winton said, wiping sweat from his brow. "There must be something we've overlooked." Edgar obeyed, flipping through pages yellowed by years of consultations. Together they studied passages on putrefaction, mortification, wounds gone bad. The illustrations were crude, but unmistakable: blackened limbs, cracked skin, swollen veins. Yet none of the listed remedies seemed adequate. Most prescribed poultices of honey and spirits, or purgatives meant to balance the humours, as though gangrene were simply a matter of temperament. "This is outdated," Mr. Winton muttered, slamming the book shut. "The rot we are seeing does not obey the rules. It spreads faster. It ignores pain. He trailed off, staring at his reflection in the glass door of a cabinet. It behaves like something alive." Just as he spoke, the shop bell jangled violently. In stepped a factory foreman with a bandaged forearm, the cloth already soaked through with a dark, glistening stain. He thrust it toward the apothecary. "Your tonic did nothing," the man spat. "The smell's worse. The flesh is turning soft." Mr. Winton's heart dropped. Soft, sweet-smelling, spreading without pain. The signs were unmistakable now. His hands shook as he guided the foreman to a chair and carefully unwrapped the dressing. What lay beneath confirmed his most terrifying suspicion. The rot was moving faster than any remedy could outrun. The flesh beneath the bandage had liquefied slightly, the edges peeling back in grotesque curls. Gas bubbles formed under the skin, rising and popping faintly, a sound so soft it might be mistaken for distant rain. For a moment, Mr. Winton could not speak. Edgar stood frozen beside him. The foreman glared. "Well, what can you give me now?" The apothecary finally straightened, his expression hollow. "Nothing," he whispered. "There is nothing in this shop strong enough to stop what has begun." The foreman cursed, storming out into the night, the scent of his rotting limb trailing behind him like a grim herald. Mr. Winton sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. The shelves around him, once symbols of hope and healing, now felt like the walls of a tomb. His tonics had failed, his knowledge had failed, and whatever force was silently claiming his neighbors, it did not fear herbs or spirits or antiseptics. As the final candle guttered and went out, the apothecary realized a chilling truth. The disease eating through the district no longer belonged to medicine. It belonged to the grave. The doctor had long believed that pain was a faithful messenger, crude, insistent, but honest. It cried out when the body was in danger, when wounds deepened, when death approached. But in recent days, he found himself confronting something far more unnerving. Patients who claimed they felt nothing at all. Not relief, not comfort, but an empty quiet where agony should have lived. One such patient arrived late one afternoon, carried by two neighbors through the doctor's back entrance to spare the family embarrassment. His name was Rowan Blake, a dock worker of considerable strength, though now he seemed shrunken by fever. His foot dangled from his leg at an unnatural angle, wrapped hastily in linen already seeping through with a dark, sickly fluid. "We feared to move him," one neighbor muttered, glancing nervously at the stained bandage. "But he insisted on walking this morning, said he couldn't feel a thing." The man shivered. Didn't seem right. Nothing seemed right anymore. The doctor guided them into his examination room, lit by two wavering candles, whose glow cast elongated shadows across the walls. He motioned for Rowan to sit, though the man nearly collapsed into the chair before obeying. His breath rattled in short bursts, and a faint smile traced his lips, not from joy, but from delirium. "Tell me what happened," the doctor said gently. Rowan blinked slowly, as if sorting through fog. "Crate fell on my foot. 2 days ago, maybe 3. Hurt something fierce at first, then stopped." He chuckled weakly, the sound brittle. "Stopped as if it never happened at all." The doctor frowned. "And since then?" Rowan shrugged. "Feels like I'm walking on a cushion. Soft, padded." His expression softened into something childlike, almost pleasant. Pleasant. The doctor felt a cold shiver creep down his spine. Pain did not vanish unless the nerves themselves had begun to rot away, unless the flesh was dying from the inside. He knelt beside Rowan and carefully unwound the linen. The odor rose instantly, thick and sweet, flooding the room like invisible smoke. The neighbors gagged and fled, clutching handkerchiefs to their faces. Rowan remained still, gazing forward with unfocused eyes. The doctor lifted the final layer of cloth and froze. The foot beneath was a grotesque parody of life. The toes had darkened to a deep purplish black, their tips blistered and peeling. Pockets of gas pushed up through the skin, shifting beneath the surface like restless insects. Where the crate had crushed the bone, the tissue had begun to liquefy, forming a glistening pool of stagnant decay. The soul, once tough and calloused, had softened to a dough-like consistency. "Do you feel this?" the doctor asked, pressing lightly against the discolored flesh. Rowan smiled faintly. "Feel what?" The doctor swallowed hard. He pressed harder. Rowan did not flinch. And there, in the dim candlelight, the doctor realized he was not merely examining an injury, he was witnessing the quiet dissolution of a living body. Rowan's nerves were dying, severed by infection, and suffocated by the rot creeping steadily up his leg. The absence of pain was not mercy. It was surrender. The doctor wrapped the limb again with trembling hands, though he knew the cloth served no purpose but to spare the man's dignity for a few more hours. When he rose, Rowan looked at him with wide, trusting eyes. "It's not so bad, is it, doctor? Just need rest?" The doctor opened his mouth, but the truth lodged like a stone in his throat. Rowan's fate was already sealed, unless drastic measures were taken, and soon. But even with amputation, the chances were slim. Too much time had passed. Too much flesh had already fallen under the rain of silence. Instead, he placed a hand gently on Rowan's shoulder. "You must return home tonight. But tomorrow morning, you must come back. And you must bring someone who cares for you." Rowan nodded, oblivious to the tremor in the doctor's voice. After he left, the doctor leaned against the wall, feeling suddenly very old. Never before in his career had he encountered death that crept forward so quietly, not with stabbing pain, or feverish cries, or violent shivering, but with numbness, with sweetness, with a deceptive calm. Outside, the fog thickened, swirling around the gas lamps in heavy rings. Inside, the last candle guttered low, and the doctor understood, with cold certainty, that the patients who felt no pain were the ones he feared losing most. The first door was marked quietly, almost shyly, as though the chalk itself hesitated to make its presence known. A simple white cross, drawn in 2 quick strokes across the dark wood of a cottage on Millwright Lane. Passers-by noticed it early the next morning, after the fog lifted enough for shapes to sharpen into meaning. Children paused their play, staring at it with wide eyes. Adults glanced once, then twice, then hurried on, their steps quickening as if proximity alone might tempt misfortune. Within a day, the meaning spread through the neighborhood like fire catching at dry cloth. A cross meant danger. A cross meant sickness. A cross meant someone inside was rotting from the inside out. Soon enough, another appeared, then another. Chalk was cheap, but its message carried the weight of stone. The doctor had not been the one to suggest marking the doors. It began among the neighbors themselves, an unspoken agreement, forged by fear. The smell drifted into stairwells and alleys, ghosting beneath windowsills, settling upon the hems of skirts and coats. People began to identify which homes the sweetness seeped from. They whispered about them at pump lines, in bakeries, at the workhouse gate. And in a time when names could bring shame, chalk offered anonymity while still providing warning. Inside the first marked cottage, Thomas Barrow's wife knelt at the bedside, her fingers tightly interlaced in prayer, though her eyes remained fixed upon her husband's darkened hand. His breath rattled unevenly, the fever burning through him with relentless heat. She had not drawn the cross, she did not have the strength, but she did not oppose it. The truth had lodged too heavily in her chest. Across the lane, Mrs. Hargreaves stared at the chalk mark, freshly added to her own door, her battered hands trembling as she touched the symbol. She had scrubbed away stains far more stubborn than chalk in her years as a washerwoman, but she did not lift a finger to erase this one. Perhaps she feared it would simply reappear. Perhaps she believed it belonged there, a kind of warning to the world that something unclean had taken hold of her flesh. In the street, whispers thickened. "They're cursed, those houses. No, it's the river water, mark my words. It's the factories, the iron dust gets into the wounds. No, it travels through the air, haven't you smelled it?" But even as theories multiplied, People kept their distance. Mothers tugged their children across to the far side of the street. Merchants left goods at the thresholds without knocking. And, at night, the lamplighter avoided the marked doors entirely, choosing to keep his flame at arm's length. The doctor hated the crosses. They made suffering public. They turned sick rooms into spectacles. Yet each morning, when he made his rounds, he found himself grateful for the grim convenience. The chalk guided him with undeniable accuracy. Every home he entered stank of sweetness, of flesh softening beneath skin, of despair. Every home held someone pale, fevered, drifting toward delirium or numbness. Every home possessed its own version of the same silent horror. One afternoon, as he inspected Clara Wells's darkened toe, he heard shouting outside. Peering from the window, he saw two neighbors arguing fiercely. One insisted that the chalk marked a family as plague-ridden. The other swore it was a sign from God, demanding repentance. Then someone noticed the doctor watching. Silence dropped like a curtain. All eyes turned to him, pleading for reassurance or confirmation. But there was nothing reassuring in his expression. With a nod, he closed the shutters, returning to Clara's bedside. Her mother clutched her child's hand with white knuckles. "Will the chalk help, doctor?" she whispered. "No," he answered gently. "The chalk is only fear made visible." The mother lowered her gaze. "Then why does it feel like the only thing anyone can do?" "Because fear sought symbols, something the helpless could hold on to when the invisible became unbearable." The doctor understood that. He understood, too, that the chalk was spreading faster than the infection now, a symbol of communal dread. As night settled, the streets transformed into a map of warning signs. Some crosses glowed faintly under moonlight, pale and spectral, like the marks left on plague houses in centuries past. Dogs avoided the thresholds. So did hope. By morning, a new cross had appeared, this one, on the apothecary's door. The doctor's breath caught when he saw it. He stepped forward, touching the chalk with the tip of his glove. It was fresh, smudged as though drawn with a trembling hand. Inside, the apothecary's shelves stood in eerie stillness. An overturned bottle lay on the counter, its contents pooled like a dark tear. Edgar, the young apprentice, emerged from the back room, his face pale as dust. "It's Mr. Winton," he whispered. "The rot has reached his arm." The doctor closed his eyes. The chalk had spoken its truth again, and as more doors awaited their mark, the neighborhood braced itself for Gangrene was no longer a collection of isolated tragedies. It was a presence moving house by house, seeking its next cross. The alley behind Lambert Street was narrow enough that two people could not walk it side by side without brushing coats. It twisted between the backs of tenements like a seam stitched too tightly, trapping soot, shadows, and the perpetual damp that never seemed to dry even in summer. Children used it as a shortcut, cats used it as a battlefield, but now, in these anxious days, even the boldest stray avoided it. For the alley had become a gathering place for flies, and not the ordinary, lazy kind that hovered around refuse heaps. These were thick-bodied, persistent creatures, arriving in black clouds that pulsed and shifted in the dim light like a living storm. Their drone filled the space with a ceaseless hum, low and metallic, as if the air itself vibrated in warning. The first person to notice was old Mrs. Penlow, who carried scraps of bread to feed the alley cats each dawn. On this morning, she stopped abruptly beneath the splintered staircase leading up to the second-floor lodgings. The flies were massed around a gutter spout, crawling over one another, dipping their heads as though drinking from something invisible. She swatted at them irritably before bending down, and recoiled so violently she dropped her basket. A bloodied cloth lay stuffed into the gutter, twisted and darkened, soaked through with a fluid that glistened unnaturally. The flies devoured it. Mrs. Penlow stumbled backward, pressing a trembling hand over her mouth. She had lived long enough to know the smell, that faint, cloying sweetness now rising from the cloth like steam. It did not belong in an alley. It did not belong outside a sick room. But here it was, soaking into the cobblestones, calling to the insects like some morbid feast. She fled, but by noon, half the neighborhood had heard of the discovery. Mothers warned their children not to use the alley. Men returning from the docks detoured wide around it, pulling up their scarves as though the stench might cling to their breath. Even the constable, a man not easily rattled, hesitated before unlatching the iron gate that marked the alley's entrance. Inside, he found more signs of quiet catastrophe. A trail of discarded bandages stretched along the wall, each one stained with the same dark seepage. A broken shoe, its leather soaked through, lay beneath a rusted drainpipe, and there, smeared faintly across the bricks at shoulder height, was a handprint, a single imprint left in a moment of desperation, the fingertips darkened as though dipped in ink. But it was not ink. The constable swore softly under his breath and stepped back. He had seen cases of wound infection before. London's narrow streets provided them in abundance. But nothing like this, nothing with such a powerful smell, nothing that drew flies in swarms so thick the air seemed to ripple with them. He left the alley as quickly as pride allowed, dispatching a boy to fetch the doctor. When the doctor arrived, lantern in hand, the flies scattered only briefly before returning with renewed fervor. He crouched beside the bloodied cloth, examining its decomposition. The fibers dissolved under the slightest touch, slipping apart into wet threads. Whatever limb this had been wrapped around was far worse off now. He followed the trail deeper, tracing where someone recently, desperately, had discarded each sign of their decay. The alley grew narrower, darker, the smell thickening with every step. At last, he found the final bandage stuffed behind a stack of splintered crates. It was fresh, still warm. The doctor swallowed hard. Someone out there was walking on a limb already half dissolved, someone who had chosen to hide their condition rather than seek help, someone terrified of the sore or of the shame that came with the chalk-marked doors. Behind him, the constable cleared his throat. "Should we search the lodgings?" The doctor shook his head. "They will come to me when the pain becomes unbearable." But he knew with a cold certainty that pain might never come at all. Numbness had been this disease's calling card. He stepped back, lantern light trembling against the brick walls. Above them, flies crawled over the wooden stairs, forming small, writhing constellations. "This alley," the doctor murmured, "is no longer safe. It's a warning." The constable nodded. "But of what?" The doctor exhaled slowly. "Of a patient who is running, and of a disease that is no longer content to stay indoors." Outside, the evening fog thickened, catching the doctor's lantern glow in fractured halos. Inside the alley, the flies droned on a funeral chorus for a victim not yet found. And somewhere nearby, a rotting limb continued its grim work in silence, moving through the city on borrowed time. The surgeon's room above the coal-smudged street had always carried an air of solemn utility. Instruments hung in neat rows upon the walls, each polished to a cold gleam. The narrow table at the center oak, darkened by decades of spilled lives, awaited its next occupant with indifferent silence. But it was the surgeon's apron, stiffened by layers of dried blood long set into its fabric, that captured the truest picture of his profession. It hung from a hook near the door, its once white cloth now a mosaic of brown, rust, and faded crimson. No matter how often it was scrubbed, the stains returned like memories that refused to fade. Tonight, those stains felt heavier than usual. A sharp rap sounded at the door shortly after dusk. The surgeon, Mr. Hollis, glanced up from his ledger, a frown carving deeper lines into his already severe expression. He had hoped for a quiet evening, the kind where he tended only to fevers or the occasional fractured wrist. But quiet had abandoned the district. Rot had taken its place. When he opened the door, Two men stood on the step, supporting a third between them. The patient's head lolled forward, chin glossy with sweat. A cloth wrapped around his thigh was soaked through with a dark, sticky wetness. "Found him in the alley by the tannery," one of the men said. "Couldn't go on, says he hasn't felt his leg since yesterday." At those words, "hasn't felt," the surgeon stiffened. "Bring him inside." The two men hauled the patient into the operating room, laying him on the table. A cloud of sweetness rose into the air as they did, thick and unmistakable. Mr. Hollis clenched his jaw. "Fetch water, hot as you can get it," he ordered the assistant, "and light every lamp." The assistant rushed off. The room brightened, shadows thinning beneath the flicker of flame. Mr. Hollis washed his hands in a basin of scalding water, though he knew cleanliness was more hope than certainty. Germs remained a theory argued in lecture halls. Here, in this fog-draped quarter of London, superstition and habit still guided most treatments. He reached for his apron. The fabric crackled faintly as he tied it around his waist, a brittle sound that made the patient stir. "Am I dying, sir?" the man whispered. Mr. Hollis paused. Surgeons were not priests. Their assurances carried no divine weight. Still, he placed a steadying hand on the man's shoulder. "You are in danger, but we will do what we can." He unwound the soaked cloth from the patient's thigh. As the final layer peeled away, the surgeon's breath caught. The wound was no longer a wound. It was an open cavern of putrefaction, edges darkened, flesh soft like broiled fruit, patches bubbling faintly beneath the surface. A greenish fluid oozed outward, its scent mixing with the sweet odor that clung stubbornly to the air. The patient watched the surgeon's expression, fear widening his eyes. "Do you see it?" he whispered. "It looked smaller this morning." Mr. Hollis swallowed. Gangrene moves swiftly when it finds the right conditions. He pressed the surrounding skin with two firm fingers. It yielded with little resistance, like wet clay. The numbness in the man's leg was complete, a sign that the death of the limb was considerably ahead of the death of the man. "Will you cut it off?" the patient asked, voice trembling between hope and terror. The surgeon hesitated, not because he doubted the necessity the leg was lost beyond question, but because he doubted the man's strength to survive the procedure. Amputation was a gamble. Without anesthetics strong enough to blunt the agony, without antiseptics powerful enough to curb infection, many patients died not from their wounds but from the brutality of the intervention. Yet the alternative was certain death. Rot this advanced would travel. "It must come off," Mr. Hollis said gravely. "Tonight." The man sobbed once, a sharp, childlike sound. "Please, don't let me feel it." The surgeon's gaze fell upon his tools, the bone saw, the knives, the iron clamps, their polished edges glinting softly beneath the lamplight. He retrieved the ether mask, its metal rim cool beneath his fingertips. "You will feel sleep first," he murmured, though he knew the sleep would be shallow, fleeting. "And then the worst will be over." The assistant returned with the boiling water, steam rising like a ghost between them. Mr. Hollis slipped on his gloves, tightened the straps of his apron, and signaled for the mask. Outside, the fog pressed against the window pane like a silent spectator. Inside, the sweetness of rotting flesh mixed with the sharpness of ether. As he lowered the mask over the patient's trembling face, Mr. Hollis whispered a prayer he'd long abandoned in his youth, not for the man's life, but for swiftness, for mercy, for something gentler than the sore. Tonight, the blood-stiffened apron would earn another stain, and in the district below, the whispers of gangrene would grow louder still. Behind the cramped row of tenements on Harrowwick Court lay a yard so foul it seemed to breathe on its own. The ground was never dry. Even in the dead of winter, when frost clung to rooftops and puddles froze in the gutters, the earth here remained slick, dark, and alive with unseen moisture. Sewage trickled along narrow rivulets between the stones, pooling in shallow depressions where refuse floated like wilted petals on a stagnant pond. No one remembered a time when the yard had been otherwise. It had always been a place avoided, a place where disease felt close enough to touch. Children, despite warnings, used the yard as a playground, darting among the lines of hanging laundry and leaping over puddles with reckless delight. Their laughter echoed between the brick walls, piercing the gloom like small, bright stars. But on this particular morning, the yard was quiet. Not a single child dared cross its threshold. The previous night's rain had worsened the stench, stirring the matted sludge into a new potency. Even the rats kept their distance. Mrs. Langford, whose ground-floor window overlooked the yard, was the first to see the pile of rags near the broken drain. At first, she thought someone had dropped laundry again, but as the morning light shifted, she noticed something unnervingly familiar in the shapes beneath the cloth, the contour of a foot, the stiffness of a leg, the unmistakable outline of a human form. Her breath hitched in her throat. She rapped sharply on the adjoining wall. "Mrs. Black, come quick." Within moments, others gathered, drawn by the tremor in her voice and the heavy scent that seeped through the air. The braver among them stepped cautiously into the yard, skirts lifted, boots sinking slightly into the muck. The pile did not move. The doctor was summoned at once. When he arrived, the yard parted around him like a sea of unease. Neighbors pressed against the walls, muttering prayers, pressing handkerchiefs to their noses. The doctor approached the pile with careful steps, his boots sloshing through the sewage. The air was thick with the sickly sweet odor he had come to dread, not the scent of illness, but of decay wearing the skin of the living. He knelt beside the body and peeled away the top layer of rags. A gasp broke from the crowd. The man beneath was still alive. Barely, but alive. His face was mottled with fever, his breath shallow, his eyes glazed and unseeing. His leg, the reason for the discarded bandages, littered throughout the alley, and now this yard was blackened from knee to ankle. The skin bubbled faintly, as though something beneath were exhaling its last. Patches of flesh had sloughed away, revealing muscle that had turned soft and grey. The man had crawled here. The trail was obvious, smear marks etched into the filth behind him, signs of hands pulling, dragging, collapsing. He had tried to reach the pump, perhaps seeking water to soothe the burning rot. But the yard, with its sewage and damp, had welcomed him like a grave. The doctor touched the man's wrist. No reaction, no pain, only cold. He motioned for two men to lift the dying laborer. "Careful," he whispered, "his flesh may not hold." As they hoisted him, part of the ruined leg tore away, slipping into the yard's sludge with a soft, sickening splash. The crowd recoiled, horror rippling like a wave through the onlookers. The doctor did not flinch, though his breath grew unsteady. He had seen the march of gangrene across many bodies these past days, but never this fast, never this complete. The sewage had hastened the rot, moisture feeding decay, filth nurturing the invisible enemy. "This yard must be closed," he said sternly, turning to the neighbors. "No children, no washing, no passage. This ground is no longer merely foul, it is deadly." But the neighbors already knew. Their faces, pale and ashen, said as much. The yard had become something new in their eyes, something haunted. As the doctor and volunteers carried the limp body away, the flies descended upon the spot where the leg fragment had fallen, their swarm rising in frenzied spirals. The stench grew stronger, clinging to coats, hair, skin. Mrs. Langford whispered shakily, "The rot is growing bolder." She wasn't wrong. For in that sewage-soaked yard, mingled with the refuse and the darkness, the disease had found perfect soil, and something in its silent appetite suggested it would not stop there. The butcher's shop on Bristlewick Row had always been a place of noise, the steady thud of cleavers against wooden blocks, the scrape of hooks sliding along rails, the heavy rustle of aprons dusted with sawdust and fat. It was a world of sharp smells and sharper tools, a place where blood dried quickly and men worked with practiced precision. But on a grey morning, thick with fog, silence settled over the shop like an unwelcome patron, and at its centre stood Samuel Pike, the butcher, staring at his own trembling hands. The accident had been small, almost inconsequential. A knife slipping as he split a side of beef. A moment's distraction, a wet handle, a cut to the base of his thumb deeper than he first realized. But clean. A butcher lived by cuts. His hands bore dozens of scars, each a story he never bothered to recount. He wrapped the wound tightly and went back to work, refusing to halt his trade over something so trivial. Yet, as the morning wore on, his thumb throbbed with a heat that did not match the chill in the room. By noon, the cloth beneath his glove felt warm and slick, and by evening, when he removed it at last, he found the wound swollen and discoloured. A faint, sweet fragrance rose from the gash, so unexpected, so out of place, that he felt his stomach twist. He washed it with brine, gritting his teeth as the salt burned the open flesh. But even as he did, a new sensation crept along his skin, numbness, spreading like frost in slow motion. He flexed his hand, blinking in confusion. The thumb did not move. The next morning, the shop smelled wrong. Blood and raw meat had their own familiar pungency, but this was different. It drifted through the room in gentle, nauseating waves, a sickly, warm sweetness that clung to every surface. His apprentice, young Henry, wrinkled his nose the moment he entered. "Sir, did something spoil overnight?" Samuel didn't answer. He couldn't. He was staring at his hand. The swelling had grown grotesque, the skin stretched, glossy and tight. A faint green tinge crept along the edges, and beneath the surface, something bubbled softly, a sound so subtle, so sinister, that Henry stepped backward instinctively. "Sir, we should fetch the doctor." Samuel shook his head, jaw clenched. "It's just infected. I've had dozens." His voice faltered as a wave of dizziness washed through him. He braced himself against the block, breathing hard. His hand dangled unnaturally, the fingers stiff, unresponsive. The numbness had climbed his wrist, swallowing sensation as it went. Henry bolted from the shop before Samuel could protest. By the time the doctor arrived, lanterns swinging in the fog, Samuel sat slumped on a stool, his arm resting across his lap. The sweet smell filled the narrow room like a suffocating perfume. "Show me," the doctor said quietly. Samuel unwrapped the cloth. The doctor inhaled sharply. The wound had widened overnight, edges softened into a mush that glistened faintly under lamplight. The flesh around the thumb had begun to liquefy, sinking inward, as though the body itself were draining away. The discoloration spiraled up Samuel's wrist in branching tendrils, green, purple, black, merging into one dreadful path toward his forearm. "Can you feel this?" the doctor asked, touching the area lightly. Samuel shook his head. "Nothing. Not since yesterday." The doctor closed his eyes briefly. "It is spreading too quickly, much too quickly." Samuel swallowed. "Will I lose the hand?" The doctor's answer was a whisper. "You will lose more than the hand if we do not act tonight." As the words settled into the butcher's shop, the hanging carcasses swayed gently, as if nodding in grim agreement. The red-stained floor, the cold iron hooks, the heavy wooden block, all bore silent witness to the irony that the man who carved flesh for a living was now being consumed by the rot he could not cut away. Henry hovered at the doorway, pale and trembling. "What must we do?" he asked. The doctor did not soften his tone. "We must remove the limb, and quickly, before the rot reaches the elbow." Samuel bowed his head, not in prayer but in resignation. For the first time in years, the butcher's hands, the hands that had fed the neighborhood, that had shaped meat with skill and care, were no longer instruments of strength. They had become the battleground of death. Outside, the fog thickened, curling against the windows like a hungry thing. Inside, the sweetness grew, filling the shop with the unmistakable scent of flesh, surrendering to darkness. And as the doctor prepared his instruments, Samuel Pike understood the truth no man wished to face. The disease did not choose the weak. It chose the wounded, and the butcher had bled. In the mining village just beyond the fog-bound district, the mornings were marked by the same ritual. A line of soot-darkened men descending into the earth before sunrise, lanterns swinging from their grips like faint stars swallowed by the pit's yawning mouth. For years, Thomas Briggs had been among them, a sturdy miner with shoulders shaped by toil, lungs weathered by dust, and hands calloused from gripping pickaxe and rope. Yet on the morning the rot chose him, something felt different. The air tasted heavy, metallic. The cold bit deeper than usual. Even the ground beneath his boots seemed to shudder, as if warning him to turn back. But miners did not heed omens. They heeded wages. The injury happened hours after the descent, far below where sunlight dared to follow. A timber support, weakened by damp, cracked unexpectedly, sending a cascade of stones tumbling down the shaft wall. Briggs dodged the worst of it, but a sharp-edged rock caught his shin, slicing through cloth and skin as easily as paper. He hissed in pain, wiped the blood away with a handful of coal dust, and muttered a curse. His fellow miners urged him to climb back up for a proper bandage, but Briggs only laughed. "It's a scratch," he said, tightening his boot. "I'll live." How many times had men spoken those very words before the rot answered them? He worked another 5 hours, unaware that the coal dust clinging to the wound would serve as a perfect breeding ground for infection. The mine's stale air, thick with damp and decay, wrapped itself around the injury like a curse. By the time he returned to the surface, the cut had swollen slightly, but he ignored it. Miners ignored everything that didn't kill them outright. He limped home through the fog, telling his wife he simply twisted his leg on a loose board. She believed him. She always had. A bowl of broth, a warm fire, and the steady ticking of the clock lulled him into sleep. By morning, the trouble had begun its silent work. His shin was warm, tender. The skin around the wound glowed faintly red. Still, he insisted on going to the mine. "A man doesn't stay home for a bruise," he muttered. But when he tried to stand, his leg buckled beneath him. A wave of dizziness forced him back into the chair. His wife knelt beside him, pulling the fabric of his trousers gently upward. She gasped. The wound had darkened overnight, not simply bruised, but discolored in a way that looked unnatural. As she watched, the edges of the gash seemed to soften, curling inward like the petals of a dying flower. A faint sweetness leaked into the air, rising like an unwelcome perfume. "You're not going anywhere," she whispered, voice trembling. Briggs protested, but his words lost their force when he touched his own skin and felt nothing. The numbness crawled along his shin, spreading outward. His fingers traced the area again and again, as if repetition might restore the sensation. His wife ran for the doctor. By midday, the swelling had doubled. The skin had begun to marinate in shades of green and purple. Tiny bubbles drifted beneath the surface, moving as though stirred by an unseen breath. When the doctor arrived at last, lantern in hand, Briggs clung to a sliver of hope. "It's infection, isn't it?" he asked. "A poultice will do." The doctor did not answer at first. He knelt beside the injured leg, peeling back the cloth with as much tenderness as dread allowed. The room filled with sweetness, unmistakable, thick, sickening. "This is no ordinary infection," the doctor said quietly. "This is gangrene." Briggs tried to rise from the chair, only to collapse again. "No, not me. Not from a scratch." "It takes only a scratch," the doctor murmured. "The mine is full of filth and damp, the perfect cradle for rot." His wife clutched her apron to her face, tears streaking her cheeks. "What must we do?" she whispered. The doctor's expression tightened. "The limb must come off. If we wait even one day, the rot will reach his blood." Briggs stared at the doctor, at his wife, at his ruined leg. Reality settled upon him like a weight pressed into his chest. He would never descend into the mine again. He would never return to the world he had known. As night fell, the fog crept under the doorframe, curling around the room like a pale ghost. The smell of sweetness lingered, clinging to the walls, to the bedclothes, to the breath of every person inside. And in the pit below the village, the miners spoke in hushed voices. Briggs didn't come back today. None dared finish the sentence, and he never will. The hospital on Pemberton Street stood like a stone sentinel against the perpetual fog, its windows tall and narrow, its corridors echoing with the muffled footsteps of nurses who moved with equal parts purpose and dread. It had been built decades earlier, before sanitation laws, before germ theory crept into the minds of progressive physicians. Back when sickness was treated not with understanding but with hope wrapped in linen. In recent years, the wards had undergone modern improvements, the walls scrubbed with harsh solutions, the floors washed daily in stingingly sharp carbolic acid. Yet no amount of disinfectant could mask the sweetness now drifting through its halls. The smell mingled strangely with the carbolic, sharpness and sweetness, sterility and rot, clashing in the air like two opposing choirs. Patients noticed it first, some complained, others wept. But most simply turned their faces toward the wall, unwilling to ask what sort of death smelled like sugar. Nurse Ellery was the first to admit, even if only to herself, that something dreadful had taken root within the wards. She had worked here for 8 years, long enough to witness epidemics of fever, outbreaks of croup, the ravages of cholera, and the silent devastation of tuberculosis. Yet none of those illnesses announced themselves with a sweetness that clung stubbornly to her apron long after she left the ward. On this particular morning, she carried a basin of hot water into Ward 5, the surgical ward, where 12 beds stood in 2 rows like pale soldiers awaiting inspection. The ward had been washed down with carbolic at dawn. Its sharp scent stung her eyes, but beneath it, she detected the familiar, dreaded perfume of decay. She set the basin down and approached bed 3. Mr. Holling, a machinist brought in after a factory accident, lay half-conscious, sweat plastering his hair to his brow. A bandage wrapped his leg, but the dressing was soaked through, dark and glistening. As Nurse Ellery leaned closer, she felt the warmth radiating from the wound even through the fabric. "Good morning, sir," she murmured, though her voice held little brightness. "Time to change your dressing." He stirred weakly. "Smell it yet?" he whispered. She froze. "Smell what?" He gave a faint, humorless chuckle. "The sweetness. It's mine now." Nurse Ellery swallowed hard. She untied the first layer of cloth and recoiled. The wound beneath was no longer something a surgeon's skill could mend. The flesh had softened into a jelly-like mass. The skin at the edges had turned grey, then black, then indistinguishable from the fluid leaking slowly onto the sheets. Worst of all was the sound, the faint hiss and pop of gas trapped beneath the decaying flesh. Mr. Holling did not flinch. "Don't hurt any more," he murmured. "Stopped hurting yesterday." Numbness again. Always numbness. A sign that the rot had advanced too far. Across the ward, other patients watched with hollow-eyed dread. They all knew. A sweet smell here meant the surgeon's saw would not be far behind. Dr. Fenwick entered moments later, his boots slick with morning frost, his expression grim. He was a man of science, a believer in progress, in sanitation, in the new age of antiseptics. Yet even he faltered at the sight of Mr. Holling's leg. "Move him to the end of the ward," he ordered quietly. "He cannot remain among the operable." Operable. Such a tidy word for salvaging the living from the dead. 2 orderlies lifted Mr. Holling gently. The bandage slipped as they shifted him, releasing a fresh wave of sweetness into the air. One orderly gagged. Nurse Ellery steadied him with a hand on the shoulder. At the far end of the ward stood a curtained-off section where the worst cases were kept. Not quarantined, for they were not contagious in the traditional sense, but separated so that those who still possessed hope might not lose it entirely. The doctor followed them in. His voice was low, pained. "We must amputate above the knee. Tonight, if he survives the day." Nurse Ellery bowed her head. "And if he cannot?" "Then," the doctor hesitated, staring at his blood-stained gloves, "then we make him comfortable." Comfortable, another word softened by time, concealing the terror behind it. As the curtain fell back into place, the ward seemed to hold its breath. The air, heavy with carbolic and sweetness, pressed downward like a suffocating blanket. Nurse Ellery washed her hands until her skin burned, yet still the smell lingered. And outside, in the waiting room, families sat stiffly, whispering prayers into the sleeves of their coats, prayers that the surgeon's sharp instruments would not be needed, that their loved ones would not be moved behind the curtain, that the sweetness drifting through the hospital was not searching for another name to claim. But deep within the ward, among the shadows and the lamplight, the rot waited. And the hospital, no matter how strongly it smelled of carbolic, could not keep it out. The small birthing room at the edge of the parish was quiet, save for the rhythmic hiss of a candle flame and the occasional creak of the floorboards under the midwife's careful steps. Midwife Agnes Fairchild had delivered hundreds of children in her long career, and though the work brought her its own exhaustion, it had always been accompanied by a certain solemn pride, a feeling that life itself flowed through her hands. But on this morning, the air carried something unfamiliar, a sweetness that hovered just beneath the scent of soap and boiled water, soft yet undeniably sinister. The first mother of the day, a young woman named Margaret Crowe, had complained only of minor aches at dawn. No one expected tragedy from such symptoms. Aches in pregnancy were common. Yet when Agnes approached to examine her, the midwife froze. Margaret's foot, partially visible beneath the thin blanket, had begun to darken along the toes, edges curling inward as though the flesh itself were recoiling. The soft, sickly sweet odour rose gently from the linens, curling around Agnes's face in a subtle warning she had learned to trust. Agnes pressed her gloved hand lightly against the patient's ankle. Margaret flinched faintly at first, then relaxed entirely. There was no real pain, none at all. Only a strange, cold emptiness beneath the skin. Agnes's heart sank. She had seen this before on factory workers, on children, on the elderly in workhouses, and each time the outcome had been the same. The flesh would continue to blacken, to soften, until the body itself betrayed the life within. She drew back, breathing softly through her handkerchief. The candlelight flickered across the room, casting the shadows of the cradle, the stool, and her own bent figure upon the walls. "This is not the usual infection," she whispered, mostly to herself. The words felt inadequate. "This is gangrene, and it does not wait." Margaret, noticing the midwife's concern, asked quietly, "Will the baby be harmed?" Agnes shook her head. "No," she said, though her voice carried a weight she did not wish to admit. "But your body is in danger. I fear the rot spreads far faster than you will feel it." Her warning hung in the air, thick as the steam rising from the kettle on the stove. Outside, the wind pressed against the window panes, carrying the faint smell of smoke and coal from the streets beyond. Inside, the sweetness continued to rise from Margaret's foot, curling upward toward the candlelight as though it sought the flames themselves. Agnes took a step back and considered her options. She could summon the doctor, but he would not arrive for hours. Even if he came, his interventions might be too late. She could attempt to wrap and bandage the foot herself, isolate the patient, or suggest amputation. But each choice carried its own shadow of despair. The young woman's husband had arrived, drawn by her muted calls for assistance. He peered over the midwife's shoulder, eyes wide, attempting to comprehend what he could not see. "What is it?" he asked, voice low and trembling. Agnes turned toward him, the candlelight reflecting in her wary eyes. "It is death moving slowly beneath the skin," she said softly, "and unless we act, it will claim her limb by limb." He swallowed, gripping her arm. "What can we do?" She shook her head. "We must wait for the surgeon, but we cannot wait long. The rot does not ask permission to spread." Even as she spoke, the sweetness grew heavier, curling beneath the blankets, threading through the room, pressing against their senses. The candle flickered violently, as though threatened by its presence. The midwife's hands trembled slightly, though she steadied them quickly. And as the hours dragged on, Agnes Fairchild knew with quiet certainty that she had delivered hundreds of lives. But today she had also encountered something she could neither soothe nor persuade, something relentless, invisible, and merciless, the disease that devoured the living from within. Outside, the village slept under a blanket of fog, unaware of the quiet horror growing in the midwife's room. Inside, the sweetness lingered, thick and suffocating, and Agnes whispered her own prayer, not for the baby, but for the mother, for her patient, for the strength to face the inevitable. In the shadows of the alleyways that ran like veins through the city, where the gas lamps flickered weakly against the fog, a young girl named Elsie moved with careful, practiced stealth. She was a rag picker by trade, sifting through refuse and discarded textiles to bring home a few pennies or scraps of cloth her mother could sell. Most of the alley's inhabitants ignored her, too accustomed to poverty and the stench of the streets to care. But Elsie carried a secret far darker than any poverty, a small cut on her forearm that had begun to blacken in the quiet hours of the night. It had started innocently enough, a jagged edge from a torn sack of rags, a nick so shallow she barely noticed. She cleaned it hastily, wrapped it in linen scraps, and continued her work as though nothing had occurred. The alley offered no sympathy, no warmth, only cold stones, rats, and the persistent smell of coal smoke. Elsie ignored the pain, assuming it would heal as all minor wounds did. But by dawn, the redness had darkened into a faint purplish hue, the edges curling in on themselves. Worse, the skin around it had begun to harden in patches, then soften in others, as though the flesh could not decide whether to resist or surrender. She tried to hide it. She wrapped the arm tightly, pulling her sleeve low over the mark, even though the fabric was thin and tattered. Each movement brought a faint, nauseating sweetness into the air, subtle, almost imperceptible, that clung stubbornly to her wrist and bled into the sleeve. Elsie knew the smell. She had caught it before in the tenements, in the workhouses, in the houses where the doctor had visited those who would not survive. It was the same, unmistakable, the perfume of rot that began quietly, hidden beneath linen and flesh, and yet carried the certainty of death. She moved cautiously through the alleys, avoiding others, keeping her distance from the families who might notice and fear the disease. Her friends, other rag pickers, had already whispered of the sweet sickness that had been spreading through the district. But Elsie could not tell them the truth. To do so would mean being marked, avoided, even dragged before the doctor. She carried the secret like a weight, knowing it could not remain hidden forever. By mid-morning, the cut had darkened further, the skin swollen, the edges peeling away slightly, revealing muscle beneath that had begun to turn soft and grey. The numbness spread with frightening rapidity. She flexed her fingers experimentally and felt nothing. The absence of pain made her heart pound with a different terror. She had heard of those whose flesh betrayed them silently, leaving them helpless, unable even to warn others. Still, she refused to go to the hospital or call the doctor. She had seen the men and women who arrived at the wards, marked with rotting limbs. She had seen the grim determination in the surgeon's eyes, the saw gleaming in candlelight, the cold and sterile carbolic masking what could not be cured. Better, she reasoned, to hide in the shadows, to work alone, and hope the disease would not consume her entirely. The alley, already saturated with fog and the lingering smells of refuse, seemed to respond to her fear. Flies hovered where the cut had brushed against her sleeve, the faint sweetness catching in the air, like a signal to the scavengers of the alley. Each step she took, careful and measured, seemed to pull the scent further into the fog, marking her as something already tainted, something that walked between life and death. By evening, Elsie found herself crouched behind a heap of rags, pressed against the cold stone wall, trembling. She dared not move her arm, dared not even touch the wound for fear of spreading the rot further. The alley, with its smells, its shadows, and the lingering sweetness, had become a cage. She whispered a silent prayer for mercy, knowing the disease could not hear her, but the fear within her heart could. The secret she carried was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the alley, to the darkness, to the disease that moved silently, patient and relentless. And in the quiet, she understood the truth. Hiding from gangrene would not save her. It only delayed the inevitable. The barber surgeon's shop on Eastwick Lane was a place where men came to be made presentable and repaired, their hair cropped neatly, and minor injuries treated with the same grim efficiency. Its windows were always fogged from the steam rising off basins of hot water, the scent of strong pomade mixing with the faint metallic tang of blood. In ordinary times, the shop was a haven of routine, hair trimmed, beards shaved, splints applied, and bandages wrapped. But in the days when gangrene spread through the district like a silent plague, it became a chamber of dread, and Thomas Gray, the barber surgeon, felt it in every creaking floorboard, in every faint groan from the street outside. His last patient arrived as twilight settled over the lane. A man in his mid-30s, a factory labourer with soot-streaked hands, carried a gash along his forearm. It was minor by the standards of the shop, a simple slice from a spinning gear, yet it was enough. The wound had been cleaned, hastily bound with linen, and left to rest overnight. But Thomas noticed immediately the telltale signs. The skin around the cut had begun to darken, a faint sheen of greenish-grey rising beneath the surface, and a sweetness lingered in the air, subtle but unmistakable. The man greeted him politely, though his voice trembled slightly. "Good evening, sir. I thought, perhaps you could look at this." Thomas nodded, masking his unease with professional composure. He gestured for the man to sit in the worn wooden chair by the basin. The room smelled faintly of vinegar, soap, and the lingering carbolic from previous treatments, but beneath that, the sweetness persisted, a reminder of what he already knew. Gangrene had found its way into the flesh of yet another unsuspecting victim. Thomas unwrapped the linen carefully, his fingers steady but his mind alert. The gash, small as it had been yesterday, was already spreading. The skin at its edges had begun to slough softly, the tissue underneath yielding with an unnatural squelch to the touch. Tiny bubbles of gas appeared beneath the surface, rising and bursting silently. The man flinched only slightly, but Thomas noticed the coldness radiating through the arm. Pain had vanished. Numbness had taken its place. "This is far advanced," Thomas said quietly, trying to temper the horror in his voice. "The wound has begun to decay beneath the skin. It spreads quickly, and the sensation you feel or do not feel is a warning, not a relief." The man's eyes widened. "I felt nothing last night. Only numbness. Is it dangerous?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Very. The infection will not wait for comfort or for courage. It will take what it needs. If we do not act, your limb, and perhaps more, will be lost." The barber surgeon had treated infections before, some mild, some grievous, but he had never confronted the invisible appetite of gangrene in its silent advance, so pervasive and swift. He prepared his tools, the knife, the scissors, the small saw, and the iron clamps he had reserved for cases when tissue needed to be removed in haste. Even the smell of ether, sharp and medicinal, was barely enough to mask the cloying sweetness that rose from the wound like a miasma. The patient swallowed hard, gripping the arms of the chair. "Will it hurt?" Thomas met his gaze steadily. Yes, though the ether will dull it. But the true pain lies in what will happen if we do nothing. The disease does not forgive hesitation. He set to work, carefully restraining the patient, his hands steady despite the dread pressing at his chest. Each movement, precise and practiced, carried the weight of inevitability. The linen around the wound was soaked through with the spreading decay, the softening flesh yielding beneath the surgeon's fingers. Outside, the street was quiet, the fog curling around lamplight like a shroud. Inside, the sweetness thickened, mingling with the sharp antiseptic, bearing witness to the last patient of the evening, one more body claimed by a disease that would not be ignored. Thomas Gray worked with grim determination, knowing that every stroke, every incision, was a battle against time itself. And in the corner of the shop, the shadows seemed to lean closer, observing silently, as though the very darkness of the alley had entered with the diseased patient, relentless and merciless. The streets of Victorian London had always been alive with a certain restless energy, but in recent weeks, the curiosity that had once inspired fairs and exhibitions had taken a darker turn. Rumours travelled faster than newspapers, and the scent of newness, coal smoke, gaslight, and the exotic perfumes of imported goods mingled with something far less innocent. The sweet, insidious odour of gangrene, now creeping into the imagination of the city itself. It began in the narrow shop fronts along Quayside Lane, where apothecaries displayed bottles of tinctures and patent medicines with ornate labels promising relief from all manner of affliction. Among the shelves, one could see the wealthy and the desperate alike peering eagerly, seeking anything that might stave off disease, ignorance, or death. They wanted novelty, new cures, new powders, new remedies, and the air hummed with anticipation. But novelty, like misfortune, often arrived dressed in disguise. At the centre of it all was Dr. Bertram Halloway, a young physician newly arrived from the university halls of Edinburgh, eager to make his mark. He moved among the clients in his small clinic, measuring out doses of laudanum, camphor, and early antiseptics, noting carefully the effects on those willing to submit to his ministrations. The patients were varied: factory workers, children whose parents had heard of Halloway's skill, washerwomen, and the occasional labourer too stubborn to rest at home. Among them was a man named Jonathan Pike, who had come in earlier that week with a small scrape on his wrist, claiming he had been struck by a gear in the textile factory. Halloway had treated the wound with a tonic of his own concoction, something new, distilled from a mixture of spirits, herbs, and a few drops of carbolic acid. The mixture smelled pungent, a sharp tang that masked the faint, insidious sweetness emanating from the wound itself. By the third day, Jonathan returned, his face pale and drawn. "Doctor," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "the sensation is gone. My hand feels nothing, but the smell. I cannot escape it." Halloway's brow furrowed. He examined the wrist carefully, lifting the bandage. The wound had changed overnight. The edges were darkened and soft, the flesh beneath glistening faintly with moisture. Tiny bubbles rose beneath the skin, and a faint hiss whispered as if the body itself were breathing. The sweet perfume, once subtle, now filled the room with a quiet insistence. "It is spreading," Halloway murmured, a chill running down his spine. "Faster than anticipated." Jonathan blinked. "But the tonic? It was new. It should have helped." Halloway shook his head. "No novelty, no tincture, no promise of modern medicine can outrun what has begun. The rot advances regardless of intention, and the absence of pain does not mean safety. It is the first sign that the body is surrendering." The patient trembled, gripping the edges of the chair. Outside, gas lamps flickered through the fog, casting long, uneasy shadows against the walls. The clinic itself seemed to hold its breath, the sweet perfume of decay weaving through the new smells of carbolic and fresh liniment, like a ghost, threading itself into the fabric of the building. Other patients waited in the small antechamber, whispering nervously, drawn by the news of Halloway's novel concoctions. They sought novelty as one might seek salvation, unaware that the same allure could not stem the creeping horror beneath skin and flesh. Halloway knew the irony. The fever for novelty, for new cures, new experiments, new hope, had brought him more patients, but it had also brought him closer to the truth of what he could not prevent. The disease that devoured the living from within was patient, clever, and impervious to human ingenuity. As dusk fell over the street and the city's fog thickened, Halloway set his tools aside, brushing his hands against his coat. The sweet, insistent smell lingered, a reminder that science, no matter how eager, could not outrun the march of death. And somewhere in the city, a new patient would arrive tomorrow, drawn by the promise of novelty, unaware that the true danger lay not in ignorance, but in the silent, merciless rot that claimed the unsuspecting with quiet inevitability. By the early hours of the morning, the street outside had been swallowed by a dense fog that crept through the alleys and wrapped itself around the tenements like a damp shroud. Inside one such dwelling, Robert Winslow lay in his narrow bed, unaware that the night had delivered its first, quiet verdict. His arm, the one he had injured only 2 days prior in a small accident at the foundry, had changed during the darkness, transformed in ways no eye could see until the linen was unwound. He had gone to sleep that night with a dull ache in his wrist, nothing extraordinary in the life of a labourer accustomed to bruises, burns, and cuts. But when he awoke, the hand that had gripped tools so confidently now felt alien. It was cool to the touch, colder than the sheets beneath it, as though the blood had abandoned the flesh during his slumber. Robert flexed his fingers experimentally. They did not respond. A hollow emptiness replaced sensation. No pain, no warmth, no warning, only cold. His wife, Martha, entered the room to draw the curtains against the fogged glass. She recoiled instantly, the faint sweetness of decay curling in the air and reaching her nostrils before her eyes had taken in the hand. "Robert," she whispered, voice catching. She knelt beside him, lifting the sleeve. The sight made her gasp, pressing a hand to her mouth. The skin at the wrist had begun to darken, a dusky violet creeping up toward the elbow. Patches of the flesh were soft and yielding, almost spongy beneath her touch. The lines of the veins had blurred into indistinguishable marbling, and a faint hiss emerged as air escaped from the pockets of decayed tissue. It was subtle, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. The hand had begun to rot from within, silently, mercilessly. Robert tried to speak. "It doesn't hurt," he murmured, his voice trembling. The absence of pain only magnified their fear. Pain had always been the herald of injury, the guide to treatment. Its absence, here, meant nothing could stop what had begun. Martha's hands shook as she wrapped the arm loosely, unable to contain the spreading dread. She sent for the doctor, knowing full well that even his skill might not be sufficient. In the meantime, she held her husband's cold fingers, feeling their lifelessness beneath the linen. The doctor arrived, lantern in hand, his coat damp from the fog. He knelt beside the bed, his face shadowed by the flickering light. The sweet smell was stronger here, rising from the linen in a tangible haze, clinging to their clothing and curling toward his nose. He examined the hand carefully, lifting the cloth and probing gently with gloved fingers. The flesh yielded beneath him with an unnatural softness, coldness radiating up the arm. "This is far advanced," he said quietly, almost to himself. "The limb has turned against the body overnight. The circulation has failed. Numbness has replaced feeling. The rot is swift." Robert looked at him, fear clear in his eyes. What must we do?" The doctor's expression was grim. "Amputation, above the elbow. If we do not remove it now, the infection will climb to the shoulder. It will claim the arm, and it may claim more." Martha clutched her husband tightly, tears tracing lines through the soot of the night. "Is there no other way?" "No," the doctor said softly. "Nothing will stop it. The disease moves too fast. The night has already taken its first toll. The cold you feel now is the hand's surrender, the first step toward death's quiet claim." Outside, the fog thickened, pressing against the windows as though eager to witness the inevitability within. The sweet, insidious smell lingered in the room, a silent reminder of the disease's relentless march. In that small, dimly lit bedroom, Robert Winslow understood the truth of the night. In the world of gangrene, pain was no longer the herald. Cold, numbness, and quiet surrender were. And the limb that turned cold overnight had already begun its final journey into darkness. By the time the morning fog had lifted from the cobbled streets of Millwright Lane, the stench of decay had already found its way through the half-open windows of the tenements. It was a sweetness so faint at first that it could be mistaken for the sugar spilled from a child's breakfast, or the cloying scent of rotting fruit left in a forgotten basket. Yet those who had grown familiar with the disease recognized it immediately, the perfume of flesh, surrendering itself to rot, subtle and insistent, curling like smoke along the floorboards and through the cracks in the doors. Jonathan Pike, a labourer of modest build and quiet temperament, had first noticed it in the night. His small wound, inflicted on the foreman's lathe at the factory, had been treated with a simple bandage and a mixture of spirits. He had gone to sleep, believing the cut minor, trivial, inconsequential. But in the silence of the room, under the dim flicker of a single candle, the injury had begun its quiet rebellion. By dawn, the skin at the edges of the gash had softened and darkened, curling inward like the edges of paper left in water too long. He lifted the bandage cautiously, eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and terror. The flesh beneath glistened faintly in the candlelight, yielding under the lightest touch. Small bubbles of gas formed beneath the surface and then disappeared silently, as if the body itself were hissing warnings. The wound had begun to peel, layer by layer, the edges lifting from the living tissue beneath. Jonathan's hand was numb. He flexed his fingers experimentally. No sensation, not a whisper of pain. A cold dread settled into his chest. This absence of feeling was far worse than the worst agony he could have imagined, a sign that the disease had already claimed dominion over the limb. The nurse who arrived at his bedside, a young woman named Agnes, had seen many forms of suffering, but none that carried such a precise, inevitable sense of doom. She pressed her gloved fingers gently along the peeling edges, and the tissue yielded to her touch like softened wax. "It is spreading faster than we can treat," she murmured. "The flesh peels away as if it has no loyalty to the living." Jonathan swallowed hard. "Will it reach my arm?" he asked, voice trembling, though curiosity compelled him to observe every change. Agnes did not answer immediately. She examined the wound in the pale light, noting the discoloration climbing along the veins, the faint hiss of trapped gas, the subtle movement of tissue as if it were alive and aware. "If we do not remove the limb soon," she said at last, "the infection will claim more than the hand. It may climb the arm." And then, her voice faltered. Outside the window, fog crept along the alleyways, brushing against the tenements like a living thing. The distant cries of children and the faint clatter of carts seemed muffled, swallowed by the thick air. Inside, the room was still except for the subtle hiss and pop of gas escaping from beneath the darkening skin. Jonathan's eyes remained fixed on the peeling edges, unable to look away even as terror filled him. The skin continued to lift, curling like brittle parchment, revealing the pale grey muscle beneath. The sweetness rose more sharply, filling the room with a thick perfume that clung to clothes, to hair, to the very air they breathed. Agnes wrapped the hand again, knowing the bandage offered no protection, only a small measure of dignity. "The peeling edge of death begins quietly," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper to herself. "It does not scream, it does not cry. It advances patiently, deliberately, until it has all it requires. Jonathan's pulse thrummed audibly in the still room. He understood now the cruel nature of the disease. The absence of pain was the herald, and the slow, peeling decay of flesh the messenger. And outside, the fog pressed tighter against the glass, as if waiting for the inevitable, the full claim of gangrene, silent and merciless, upon its next victim. The morning air was damp and heavy, pressing against the windows like an invisible hand, carrying with it the faintest hints of coal smoke, damp wool, and something far more sinister. Inside the small chamber on Hawthorne Street, Mr. Alcott sat on the edge of his narrow bed, his sleeve rolled up to reveal the wound on his forearm. A cut received from a slip at the factory the day before had seemed trivial at first, barely more than a scratch. Yet overnight, the small wound had betrayed him. The skin around it had darkened, softening in places, the edges curling slightly, as though recoiling from the life they once contained. But what truly unnerved Mr. Alcott, and all who had witnessed this progression before, was the black line, a thin, inky streak that had begun at the base of the wound now crawled up the forearm, creeping steadily toward the elbow. It moved silently, but with intent, a harbinger of decay invisible to the untrained eye, yet impossible to ignore. He flexed his fingers experimentally, his hand trembling. The numbness had spread farther than he had realized. There was no pain, only a strange, oppressive emptiness that felt as if his body were no longer his own. The sensationless limb dangled loosely from his shoulder, a foreign object bound only by his consciousness. The midwife who had arrived earlier, a young woman named Ellen, trained in both herbal remedies and early surgical care, examined the limb carefully, her fingers tracing the blackened line as she whispered to herself. "The infection climbs like smoke up a chimney," she said softly, almost reverently. "It moves faster than our hands, faster than our knowledge. It waits for no one." Mr. Alcott swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the mattress as his eyes followed the line's silent ascent. It was hypnotic in its inevitability. The darkness under the skin seemed almost alive, pulsating faintly with a rhythm that mimicked a heartbeat, yet betrayed none of its warmth. The faint hissing of trapped gas beneath the epidermis gave the impression of a quiet, deliberate breathing, a slow and merciless pulse that reminded him of the countless others who had come before. Outside, the fog pressed heavier against the street, muffling footsteps and the distant clatter of carts. Inside, the sweetness of decay began to rise into the room, faint yet unmistakable, curling around the candlelight and mingling with the acrid smell of carbolic and liniment. It clung to the air, to the walls, to the linen on which Mr. Alcott rested, a spectral witness to the slow siege of the disease. The doctor, called by Ellen, arrived with his lantern and a thin, grim expression that had become familiar to all who faced gangrene. He crouched beside the bed, eyes narrowing as he observed the creeping black line. "It climbs too quickly," he murmured. "Above the wrist now. Soon it will reach the elbow if we do not act. The flesh obeys nothing but its own decay." Mr. Alcott swallowed, his throat dry. Will the amputation stop it?" The doctor hesitated, the faint flicker of candlelight catching the sweat on his brow. "It may," he said softly, "but even that is no guarantee. The black line moves silently, without respect for skill or will. Every hour we delay allows it to advance further." Ellen pressed a hand to his shoulder. "You must rest," she whispered, though she knew the futility of the words. The patient's mind was already occupied with the creeping shadow under his skin. The black line continued its ascent imperceptibly, a silent predator that neither screamed nor announced its intent. It was patient, insidious, and merciless, the very essence of the disease that had begun to haunt the district, leaving numb limbs and perfumed death in its wake. Outside, the fog deepened, and the sweet, insistent smell pressed through the cracks in the window. Inside, Mr. Alcott's arm lay limp, and the black line continued crawling upward, a quiet, unyielding messenger of the rot that would consume all who did not heed its warning. By late afternoon, the room was thick with a quiet unease, punctuated only by the low hiss of gas lamps struggling against the growing fog outside. The sweet, pervasive scent of decay had become almost tangible, curling through the cracks in the floorboards and settling in the corners like a patient observer. Nurse Agnes leaned over the patient, her hands gloved and trembling ever so slightly, as though the warmth of human touch could repel the inevitable. The man on the bed, a young labourer named Thomas Kent, had come to the infirmary hours before, his right leg bandaged hastily after a factory accident. A small nick had been overlooked at first, considered trivial, but in the hours since, the limb had begun to betray him in ways far worse than ordinary infection. His skin had darkened, swelling in places and softening in others, and beneath the surface a sound had begun, a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, that rose and fell with the shallow rhythm of his breathing. Agnes leaned closer, straining to hear. At first, it seemed nothing more than the settling of the boards, the hiss of the gas in the lamps. But soon she realized it was coming from the limb itself, tiny bubbles of gas trapped beneath the skin, rising and popping with the faintest hiss, a whisper of rot, speaking in the language of decay. She stepped back, covering her mouth with her apron as the scent swelled around her, a sweetness that pressed at her senses like smoke, insidious and cloying. The doctor arrived, his presence bringing a brief, heavy stillness to the room. He knelt beside the patient, lantern held high to illuminate the mottled skin of the leg. The gas bubbles were now evident to him as well, small pockets beneath the discoloured tissue, rising slowly like air trapped in stagnant water. "This is gas gangrene," he said quietly, voice low, almost reverent in its gravity. "You can see it, hear it. The whispers beneath the skin are its herald. The muscle is fermenting, decaying from within. It moves with a silence that mocks our haste, a patient and merciless foe." Thomas's eyes widened in the dim light. It hisses?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the low groan of the wind outside. The doctor nodded. "Yes, and it will continue until the limb is removed, and even then, if it has spread too far, the rot may follow. It does not speak to fear. It does not answer pleas. It simply advances." Agnes held the patient's hand, noticing the numbness already climbing his calf. Pain had fled, leaving a void that was almost worse than agony. The limb was no longer part of him in the sense he had known. It belonged to the disease now, a vessel for the quiet whisper of death. Outside, the fog pressed against the window panes, muffling the cries of children in the street and the distant rattle of carts. Inside, the air was thick, heavy, saturated with the scent of carbolic, linen, and the sweet, rising perfume of decay. Agnes's heart pounded in her chest as she leaned closer again, her eyes tracing the subtle undulations beneath the skin, the faint rise and fall of bubbles that whispered of tissue fermenting, of life being consumed from the inside. The patient shivered. Will it kill me?" The doctor's jaw tightened. "It will, if we do not act. The whispering gas beneath the flesh is not a warning, it is an announcement. You must be prepared to lose the limb, perhaps more." Thomas nodded faintly, eyes wide with understanding. He pressed his fingers to the sheet, feeling the cool linen beneath his numb hand, and realized he was already living on borrowed time. The gas beneath his skin continued its soft hiss, rising and falling like the pulse of a predator, patient and unyielding. Agnes straightened, her apron clutched to her chest. "We must prepare," she whispered, almost to herself. This whisper cannot be ignored. It speaks for the rot, and it speaks for death. The doctor nodded, gathering his instruments. Lanterns flickered, casting the shadows of the room across the walls like moving spectres, and beneath it all, the gas gangrene whispered on, patient, insistent, and merciless, a voice no prayer could silence. The first light of dawn seeped reluctantly through the narrow windows of the infirmary, grey and reluctant as if the sun itself feared the chamber within. Candles flickered in the corners, their flames trembling against the thick haze of carbolic and the faintly cloying sweetness that pervaded the air. Nurse Agnes moved quietly along the floorboards, setting instruments on the table with careful precision, each metal surface glinting faintly in the dim light. Today, the operation would take place the first for Thomas Kent, whose leg had become a vessel for gangrene so advanced that even the doctor's experience offered little comfort. The room was silent except for the subtle hiss of gas trapped beneath the blackened flesh, a sound that had haunted the night and now seemed to rise in anticipation of what was to come. Thomas lay on the table, pale and still, his eyes flickering toward the flickering candlelight with an expression of quiet resignation. He understood what the doctor had said the night before. The limb must be removed, and even then, survival was no certainty. The numbness that had crept upward along his leg made the procedure almost surreal. There would be no cry of pain, no pleading, only the cold, deliberate precision of the surgeon's hands and the quiet whisper of death beneath the skin. Dr. Fenwick adjusted the ether mask carefully over Thomas's face, the metal rim cool against his trembling hands. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself, though he knew the weight of the operation would linger long after the patient was unconscious. The assistant held the patient's other limbs, firm but gentle, while Nurse Agnes applied the final checks, instruments sharpened, clamps ready, the saw poised like a blade waiting to sever more than just flesh. The room smelled of iron, carbolic, and the faint, rising sweetness of decay. Thomas's leg had darkened overnight, the blackened line creeping upward toward the knee. Tiny pockets of gas moved beneath the skin, visible in the flickering candlelight as pale, irregular bubbles. The surgeon's gloved fingers traced the contours of the wound one final time, noting how the flesh had softened to a disturbing jelly-like consistency. "Are you ready?" Dr. Fenwick asked softly, his eyes meeting Thomas's. Thomas nodded faintly, lips pressed tightly together. "Do what you must," he whispered. The words were calm, almost eerily so, considering what awaited him. The doctor lifted the scalpel, its edge catching the weak morning light. The first incision was deliberate, precise, slicing through the skin that had surrendered to the disease. The smell intensified immediately, a thick, cloying sweetness that rolled through the room like smoke. Gas bubbles hissed faintly as the surgeon cut through the tissue, and the assistants flinched, though their hands remained steady. The operation continued in silence, punctuated only by the soft hiss and pop of gas escaping from the decayed flesh, the quiet drip of fluids onto the metal tray below, and the muted exhalations of those who bore witness. Nurse Agnes held the ether mask closer, ensuring the patient remained unconscious while the limb, once a part of him, was slowly severed from life. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. The surgeon worked with grim determination, mindful of every movement, every slice, every pull. The blackened flesh peeled away in layers, yielding reluctantly, as though resisting the inevitability. And when at last the limb was removed, the sweet scent did not immediately abate. It lingered, curling around the chamber like a final whispered acknowledgement of the disease's power. Thomas's pulse was faint but steady, a fragile tether to life. He would survive, though the loss of the limb marked him irrevocably. Nurse Agnes pressed a cool hand to his brow, feeling the sweat glisten there, and whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. Outside, the fog had thickened, muffling the city and pressing against the infirmary windows like an unseen audience. Within, the room was still except for the soft rhythm of the patient's breathing. The operation at dawn had begun with inevitability and ended with grim mercy. Yet the faint, insidious sweetness lingered, a reminder that, despite human skill and determination, the disease that stalked London would not be easily denied. In a dimly lit chamber on the upper floor of the infirmary, the morning sun struggled to pierce the thick fog curling beneath the tall windows. The room smelled of carbolic and damp linen, mingling with the faint sweetness that had become the signature of the disease stalking the city. A young man named Edwin Harper lay upon the narrow bed, his face pale, but his eyes bright with an unsettling energy. His right hand, wrapped in layers of linen, had been injured 3 days prior by a falling beam at the mill, a seemingly minor wound that had already begun to betray him. When the nurse removed the bandages, Edwin grinned faintly, showing a row of white teeth beneath flushed cheeks. The skin around the wound had darkened to a bruised violet, curling slightly at the edges, softening into the consistency of damp paper. Tiny bubbles of gas hissed faintly beneath the surface, almost like whispers. Despite this, Edwin chuckled, a low, nervous sound. "It doesn't hurt," he said with a wry smile, flexing his fingers experimentally. "Feels funny, like it's asleep." The nurse, Agnes, recoiled slightly, pressing a hand to her apron. She had seen many forms of suffering, but the absence of pain in a wound so advanced was unnerving. The disease moved quietly, invisibly, yet with a certainty that defied the patient's bravado. The subtle hiss of trapped gas beneath the blackened flesh was a whisper of what the limb had become, no longer fully part of the living body, yet still consuming, still claiming. Dr. Fenwick entered, lantern in hand, his expression tight with the weight of experience. He knelt beside the bed, lifting the linen with care, revealing the spreading darkness beneath. The flesh had softened further overnight, the edges peeling back slowly, and the blackened line of decay climbed steadily toward the wrist. The faint hiss of gas punctuated the silence of the room. "Do you feel anything?" he asked Edwin, pressing gently with a gloved finger along the edge of the wound. Edwin shook his head, still smiling faintly. "Nothing," he replied. "Not a thing. Feels strange, almost pleasant, in a way." The doctor's jaw tightened. Numbness was the true harbinger of the disease. Pain was a warning, its absence a declaration of surrender. The rot had claimed not only the flesh but the nerves, silencing sensation as it advanced. Dr. Fenwick placed a hand firmly on Edwin's shoulder, steadying the young man against the inevitable. "This is far advanced," the doctor said quietly, as though speaking to himself. "The limb must be removed. If we wait, the infection will climb, and we may lose more than the hand." Edwin's smile faded, replaced by a faint shadow of comprehension. "You mean, I'll lose it?" "Yes," the doctor replied softly. "The rot does not forgive hesitation." Despite this, Edwin's initial laughter lingered in the room, a faint echo of denial and bravado. It was a defense, Agnes realized, a thin mask against the terror of what he already knew in the depths of his mind. But even as he lay there, the limb continued to betray him, blackened flesh peeling, softening, the hiss of gas rising in a quiet, relentless rhythm. Agnes adjusted the ether mask over his face, the metal cold against his skin. "Sleep first," she whispered. "Then the rest will be over." Edwin exhaled through his nose, eyes half closed, and let the ether's influence take him. The faint, sweet smell of decay pressed thicker against the chamber, curling into the folds of the blankets, the linens, and the very walls themselves. The disease had claimed his limbs silently, mercilessly, and soon it would be severed from his body in an act both brutal and merciful. Outside, fog pressed against the infirmary windows like an unseen observer, as though London itself paused to watch. Inside, the hiss continued, the whisper of rot, a voice only the keenest senses could perceive, and Edwin Harper laughed no more, though the memory of it lingered, a fragile defiance against the inevitability that had finally arrived. By mid-morning, the narrow room smelled of damp linen, ether, and the unmistakable perfume of decay, a subtle, sickly sweetness that clung to the corners and pressed against the walls. Outside, fog pressed low over the cobblestones, curling around the lamplights like smoke from a funeral pyre. Inside, the patient, a man named William Harker, lay upon the narrow bed, his body trembling from fever and fear, though his eyes burned with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The wound on his forearm had begun as a simple nick caught on the edge of a factory press. The flesh had bruised and swollen, the skin darkening gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. But overnight, the disease had revealed itself fully. The edges of the injury had turned black, curling inward as if recoiling from the life within. The surface had softened in places, yielding to the touch like damp parchment, and beneath, faint bubbles of gas formed and popped intermittently, the soft hiss audible only to those who listened closely. Nurse Agnes leaned over the patient, her gloved fingers pressing gently against the blackened edges. "It's moving faster than I expected," she murmured, though the words felt insufficient. The wound had begun to climb steadily, a dark line creeping along the forearm toward the elbow. Every inch of progress seemed deliberate, methodical, the disease working with a patience and intelligence that unsettled even the most experienced hands. William exhaled shakily, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "I don't feel it," he said quietly. "Nothing. It's numb. It doesn't hurt at all." Agnes pressed a hand to his forehead, noting the damp sheen of sweat. "That is the danger," she said softly. "Pain is a warning. Its absence tells us only that the disease has claimed what it needs. The rot moves silently, taking hold before we can intervene." The doctor arrived moments later, lantern in hand, his coat damp with fog from the streets. He knelt beside the bed, raising the linen carefully to inspect the limb. The blackened edge glistened faintly under the light, curling further as though eager to detach itself entirely from the living tissue beneath. Tiny pockets of gas shifted beneath the surface, rising and falling in slow, deliberate rhythm. "This is advanced gas gangrene," the doctor said quietly, his voice tense. "The edges of the flesh are no longer capable of resisting the disease. The blackened border is growing steadily, climbing toward the elbow. If we wait, it will continue upward, and there may be little we can do to save the limb, or perhaps the patient." William swallowed, his throat dry. Will it be amputated?" he asked, a tremor in his voice betraying the effort to remain composed. "Yes," the doctor said softly. "It must be removed above the elbow. It is the only way to halt the advance of the rot." A silence settled over the room. The soft hiss of gas from the blackened tissue was the only sound, punctuating the quiet tension. The sweet, insidious odor rose thicker, curling around the lamp flame and settling into the sheets, the linens, and the air itself. Agnes held the ether mask in her hands, preparing for the moment when William would drift into unconsciousness. He looked at her, pale and wide-eyed, as though the room itself had grown alive with the disease. "Will I wake again?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Agnes pressed a gentle hand to his arm. "You must," she whispered. "We do all we can. The blackened edge of the flesh has taken hold, but you still have life. We will do our best to preserve it." The doctor laid his instruments carefully, the polished steel glinting under the candlelight. Outside, the fog pressed ever closer against the windows, wrapping the city in silence. Inside, the blackened edge of the flesh waited, patient, inexorable, a warning that gangrene did not ask permission to claim what it desired. And William Harker, with numb fingers and a cold, fevered arm, understood that the disease was no longer a threat in the shadows. It was the master of the room itself. The room was dim, lit only by a pair of flickering candles whose flames wavered with the draught pressing beneath the door. Outside, the city's fog lay thick and silent, muffling the distant clatter of carts and the muted cries of children playing in the alleys. Inside, the chamber smelled sharply of carbolic, damp linen, and the faintly cloying sweetness of decay, a perfume that pressed against the senses and refused to leave. Samuel Baines lay upon the narrow bed, his chest heaving in ragged breaths. The injury to his calf had begun 3 days prior, a mere nick from a misaligned piece of iron at the foundry. At first, it seemed trivial, a scratch that would mend in the ordinary course of things, but the night had been long, and the rot had worked quietly, deliberately, beneath the skin. By the time Samuel awoke that morning, the edges of the wound had darkened to a dusky violet, softening in places, curling away from the living flesh, like the petals of a dying flower. He flexed his toes experimentally and felt nothing. Numbness had spread quickly along the leg, consuming sensation entirely. And yet, in some corner of his mind, his body fought against the encroaching decay, fever spiking, pulses thrumming erratically, muscles tensing in resistance. But it was too late. The rot had claimed the tissue beyond recovery, moving with a patience that outlasted human effort. Nurse Agnes leaned over him, gloved hands trembling slightly, though her touch was careful and deliberate. "The infection spreads quickly," she murmured. "It will not stop until the tissue has surrendered entirely." She pressed a hand lightly against the darkened calf. The flesh yielded, soft and unresisting, and a faint hiss rose from beneath the surface as gas pockets collapsed and burst quietly. Samuel groaned, a low, involuntary sound, though it was more a reaction to the realization than to actual pain. The disease had already robbed him of sensation. His body, however, continued to rebel in other ways. A rising fever, chills that rattled his frame, and a tremor that moved through his limbs, as though warning the mind that it had arrived too late to intervene. The doctor arrived shortly after, lantern swinging in the dimness. He knelt beside the bed, raising the linen carefully to expose the wound fully. The edges of the calf had begun to blacken more aggressively, a creeping border that climbed upward with deliberate precision. The soft, sweet smell intensified, pressing against the senses with an almost sentient insistence. "This is advanced gangrene," the doctor said quietly, almost to himself. "The body fights, yes, but it is too late. The tissue is beyond saving. The fever, the shivering, the pulse, all are signs of resistance, but the disease ignores them." Samuel's eyes widened. "Then it will take my leg?" he whispered. "Yes," the doctor replied gently, "and possibly more if we delay. The body cannot outrun the disease once it has claimed dominion. You must prepare yourself." Agnes adjusted the ether mask over Samuel's face, her hands steady despite the rising tension. "It will dull the sensation," she whispered, "but the removal of the limb is inevitable." The young man exhaled shakily, understanding fully that his body's struggle had been a matter of hours, not days. The warmth of life still clung to him, but the part of him that had resisted too long now lay in the hands of rot. Outside, the fog pressed harder against the windows, curling like smoke through the city streets. Inside, the hiss of gas beneath the blackened flesh continued its quiet work, a whispered testament to the disease's patient power. Samuel Baines, once strong and unyielding, now lay humbled before it, his body's fight rendered useless by the inexorable advance of decay. And as the lanterns flickered and the ether took hold, the rot moved on, undeterred, leaving only the faintly sweet perfume of its silent victory in the air, a grim reminder that in the world of gangrene, resistance came too late. The fever arrived quietly, almost politely, the night after Thomas Milligan was admitted to the infirmary. At first, it was nothing more than a warmth beneath the blankets, a subtle heat that tugged at the edges of consciousness. He thought it was the lingering chill of the draughty room, or the sweat from exertion earlier in the day. But as the hours passed, the warmth thickened into a steady blaze, crawling beneath his skin and coiling around his veins like a slow, insistent serpent. By dawn, Thomas lay propped upon the narrow bed, sheets clinging to him in damp folds. The injury to his calf, a small puncture from a mismanaged pulley, had transformed overnight. The edges of the wound darkened into shades of violet and black, curling inward in a slow, deliberate rebellion of flesh against life. Tiny bubbles of gas rose beneath the skin, popping faintly, a soft hiss that mingled with the sound of his rapid, shallow breaths. Nurse Agnes leaned over him, gloved hands pressed carefully against the coarse linen. She could feel the heat radiating from the limb, yet beneath it, the flesh was cool to the touch, a contradiction that set her nerves on edge. "The fever is high," she murmured, almost to herself. "But it cannot match what is happening beneath the skin." Thomas attempted to lift the leg slightly, but it felt heavy, unresponsive. The numbness had spread steadily from the wound, climbing along the calf and up toward the knee. He exhaled sharply. "I can feel it. I can't feel it," he said, voice trembling. "The fever burns, but my leg, it's nothing." The doctor arrived shortly thereafter, lantern in hand, face drawn with concern. He knelt beside the bed and lifted the linen carefully. The wound beneath was a marvel of grotesque precision. The edges had softened completely, the darkened tissue collapsing inward, revealing layers of muscle that had begun to turn grey and gelatinous. The soft hiss of trapped gas escaped in irregular bursts, like a whispering of death itself. "This is advanced gangrene," the doctor said quietly, voice heavy with gravity. "The fever is a symptom of the body's fight, but it is a fight already lost. The rot has moved faster than the blood can carry its warning. Every pulse, every surge of warmth is insufficient. It cannot outrun the disease." Thomas's eyes widened. "So, the fever won't save me?" he asked, a tremor in his voice. "No," the doctor replied softly. "The body is desperate, but the disease is patient, relentless. It outpaces the bloodstream, consuming tissue faster than your own defenses can respond." The patient exhaled shakily, the weight of understanding settling over him like the thick fog pressing against the infirmary windows. He had hoped that fever, that rise of heat, might stave off the inevitable, that the body's own forces could resist the slow, creeping blackness that climbed up his leg. But the disease ignored the pulse, the warmth, and the color. Only the flesh itself mattered, and it moved with quiet certainty. Nurse Agnes prepared the ether mask, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted it over Thomas's face. "Sleep first," she whispered. "Then the procedure. The fever will not stop the rot, but this may spare you its full cruelty." The patient's breathing grew shallow, and the faint, sweet scent of decay intensified in the room, curling into the blankets, the linens, and the very walls themselves. The fever continued to surge, a futile protest against the blackened tissue, a last, defiant symphony of life. Outside, the fog pressed closer against the windowpane, muffling the distant sounds of the city. Inside, the gas pockets hissed beneath the skin, a whispered testimony to the disease's silent, unyielding progress. The fever raged, but the rot had already outstripped it, claiming its territory before the body could even react, leaving Thomas Milligan to face the inevitability of amputation and the quiet triumph of gangrene. By late afternoon, the fog had settled heavily over the district, curling through narrow alleys and pressing against the tenement windows like a living, cold hand. Inside one such house, the room where Thomas Milligan had succumbed lay quiet, the candles guttering faintly, their flames trembling against the draught that pressed beneath the door. Outside, distant footsteps and the faint rattle of carts passed unnoticed, as if the city itself had bowed in recognition of the silent tragedy within. The surgeon had done what he could. Amputation had been swift, deliberate, and merciful, though mercy, in this context, was measured in the preservation of life at the expense of limb. Thomas had drifted under the influence of ether, pale and unconscious, while the blackened rot was excised with practiced precision. But even with the limb removed, the infection had moved too far. The rot had climbed, silent and inexorable, beyond what any surgeon could reach. His blood had been too slow, his flesh too compromised. By the time the ether wore off and consciousness returned, Thomas Milligan had already begun to fail. Nurse Agnes had held his hand in the quiet moments before the end, noting how the faint warmth of life persisted stubbornly, only to be overwhelmed by the inevitable coldness of decay. The sweet, insistent scent of gangrene lingered in the room, mingling with the harsh tang of carbolic, pressing against the senses like a soft, cruel reminder that death had arrived, unannounced and unasked. By the time the registrar arrived to record the passing, the house was silent but for the faint creak of floorboards and the low sigh of the wind against the windows. The death certificate was drawn with a careful hand, its words precise but unsatisfying. Cause of death, gangrene, secondary to infection. No explanation could capture the silent horror, the speed at which the disease had claimed him, nor the subtle cruelty of its progression. The family gathered quietly around the table, hands folded, eyes downcast. Their grief was deep but punctuated by confusion. They had witnessed the fever, the pale skin, the swelling, yet the absence of pain remained the cruelest irony. How could a man suffer so thoroughly without a single cry? How could flesh rot and collapse without the body raising alarm? The certificate offered no answers, no solace, no narrative beyond the cold, clinical words penned in ink. Outside, the fog pressed ever closer, muffling the city into a soft, suffocating hush. The neighbors who had watched from a distance whispered among themselves, uneasy and silent. The chalk mark on the door had been removed, but its memory lingered like a shadow, a quiet warning to the living of what had occurred behind the walls. The sweetness in the air remained faint but insistent, a spectral presence that refused to leave, a reminder of the invisible enemy that had claimed Thomas Milligan. Nurse Agnes lingered a moment longer, straightening the sheets and pressing a cool cloth to the forehead of the still body. Her heart ached for the finality of what she could not prevent. In her years, she had seen wounds, illness, and decay, but never with such patient, deliberate cruelty. Gangrene did not announce itself with fever, with shrieks, or with convulsions. It whispered, it crept, it claimed. By the time it was recognized, it was already complete. The registrar collected the papers, their weight as heavy as the grief in the room. The candlelight flickered once more, casting the shadows of the family upon the walls like elongated echoes of loss. The sweet perfume lingered faintly in the air, entwined with the scent of carbolic, linen, and faint smoke from the street. And so Thomas Milligan was recorded, in cold, unfeeling ink, as yet another victim of a disease that answered no questions, offered no warnings, and left behind only the hushed horror of the living, a lingering scent of decay, and a certificate with no answers. Outside, London carried on, fog pressing, wind sighing, and the quiet, patient advance of gangrene waiting for its next victim. The Chamber of Parliament was thick with tension, the air heavy with the scent of candle smoke, ink, and the faintly oppressive perfume of heated bodies. Outside, fog wrapped the city in grey silence, curling along the streets and into the alleys where disease whispered through the tenements. Inside, the representatives of London's boroughs had gathered, some with faces pale from the early hours, others flushed with indignation, all drawn together by a crisis that no law, however well-intentioned, could fully contain. The debate began with mild pleasantries, formalities that masked the unease lurking beneath every word. Then, slowly, the discussion turned to the recent outbreak that had begun in the poorer quarters, the insidious spread of gangrene that claimed limbs, bodies, and even lives with a quiet, merciless precision. The sweet, cloying scent of decay had infiltrated neighborhoods, entering homes, workshops, and hospitals alike, leaving fear in its wake. A representative from Whitechapel rose first, his voice trembling slightly despite the effort to sound composed. "Honourable gentlemen," he said, "it is no longer sufficient to speak of illness in vague terms. Filth, overcrowding, and insufficient sanitation have allowed a disease to flourish unnoticed. Men, women, and children are being consumed by wounds that rot in the night. And yet, our laws do little to address the environments that breed such horror." A murmur ran through the chamber, half of agreement, half of unease. The disease was not polite. It did not respect social class. In workhouses, alleys, and factories alike, the rot had advanced faster than physicians could intervene, leaving bodies that were numb, blackened, and impossibly soft. Families hid their afflicted behind doors marked with chalk crosses, fearing both stigma and the surgeon's saw. Another member, representing a wealthier borough, countered sharply. "We must not cast blame so broadly. These conditions have existed for centuries. Disease is not the product of our governance alone. We cannot legislate vigilance nor enforce morality in the homes of every labourer. It is an unfortunate truth, yes, but to suggest that Parliament has failed." The first speaker's eyes narrowed. "It is not morality we address, but the duty to safeguard life. These wounds, left untreated, ferment in the warmth of neglect. Gas gangrene spreads silently, claiming limbs and lives before the cry of pain can even reach a surgeon. The rot moves faster than compassion, faster than cure. And yet our city allows it to fester." The chamber fell silent as a thin aide delivered a note to the speaker's desk, a report of yet another victim, a child, a washerwoman, a factory labourer. Names and addresses, details of the blackened limbs, the numbness, the soft, insidious collapse of flesh. Each entry was a testament to the disease's cruel efficiency. A third representative, older and gaunt, cleared his throat. "Gentlemen," he said slowly, "we speak of sanitation, yes, but also of courage. Our hospitals, our surgeons, our nurses, these are the first lines of defense, and yet they are overwhelmed. The smell of decay, the sweet perfume of death, haunts even the wards where the carbolic is strongest. If we legislate only, we legislate too late. Action must be immediate, forceful, and relentless." As the debate continued, voices rose and fell, formal yet laden with fear. Maps were unrolled, showing districts where the disease had appeared, streets where the fog carried more than chill air, and homes where chalk crosses marked the living dead. Candles flickered across polished wood and serious faces, casting long, trembling shadows that mirrored the creeping dread that had already infiltrated the city. Outside Parliament, London moved on in its foggy slumber. But inside, among the scent of wax and ink and whispered urgency, the men and women who shaped the laws of the land understood that the city's wealth and sophistication could not halt the march of gangrene. Filth, neglect, and the quiet cruelty of invisible disease demanded more than debate. They demanded recognition, intervention, and the stark acknowledgement that sometimes legislation itself could not outrun death. And in the fog beyond the chamber walls, the scent of decay pressed against the city, waiting, patient, and merciless. The presses of the London Gazette groaned and rattled in the dimly lit basement, ink-stained rollers turning slowly, stamping letters onto paper with a relentless rhythm. The machines, warmed by the steam of boiling ink, filled the room with a haze that mingled with the faint smell of candle wax and damp stone. Yet beneath it all, something new had found its way into the air, a subtle sweetness, almost imperceptible, that clung to the edges of the typeset and pressed faintly against the lungs of the printers. It was a scent of rot, of decay that travelled silently, and the journalists knew instinctively that the story of gangrene could no longer be contained behind closed doors. The editor, a lean man named Alistair Crowther, rubbed his hands together nervously, his spectacles sliding slightly down the bridge of his nose. "We must print it," he said, voice low, almost as if speaking aloud would summon the disease itself. The people need to know. The public must understand what is happening in Whitechapel, Stepney, and every alley in between. His assistants nodded, though none looked at each other directly. The sweet, cloying odour seemed to press heavier against the room with every passing moment, curling around the machinery and the stacks of freshly cut paper. They had received reports from hospitals and doctors, notes smuggled from midwives and apothecaries, detailing the victims, blackened limbs, numb extremities, the soft, insidious collapse of flesh. The disease moved silently, patient and cruel, and now it had been given a voice, written in ink for the city to read. A young journalist, Penrose, leaned over a table, reading aloud from the latest report. A labourer, 32 years of age, succumbed to gangrene following a minor injury at a factory. The flesh softened, discoloured, and became numb before the fever took hold. The surgeon's interventions were insufficient. Chalk marks were placed on doors to warn neighbours. He paused, swallowing hard. "It is spreading, sir. We cannot hide it any longer." Crowther nodded grimly. "Print it exactly as it is. Facts, names if necessary. Do not embellish. The city needs to see the truth, however bitter." The presses began their relentless work, each sheet leaving the machine damp with ink, curling faintly in the morning chill. The headlines were stark. Gangrene creeps through London. Numb limbs, blackened flesh, and silent rot. The sweet perfume of decay seemed to rise from the words themselves, pressing against the readers even before the papers left the press room. By noon, the first deliveries had begun. Children ran through the streets, clutching freshly printed sheets, showing their parents the stark black headlines. Mothers gasped as they read of victims they might have known. Fathers muttered under their breaths, gripping collars and hats. The chalk marks on doors, the faint sweetness in the air, the hushed whispers of neighbours, all were given substance. A story told in stark, unyielding ink. Some readers dismissed the words at first, convinced that exaggeration had entered the press. Yet by evening, hospitals were overwhelmed with those who feared they too might carry the invisible curse. The smell of decay seemed to grow heavier in the alleys as people ran errands, paused at street corners, or peered cautiously through the windows of infected homes. Gangrene, once hidden in the shadows of ignorance, now marched openly through the city, its presence confirmed and amplified by the printed word. Crowther leaned back in his chair, pale and exhausted, listening to the distant chatter of the streets and the faint rustle of papers in the office. He had given voice to the disease, but in doing so, he had spread fear as tangibly as the rot itself. Outside, the fog clung stubbornly to the city, curling beneath the lamplights and pressing into the corners of homes and alleys alike. And in that press room, thick with ink and wax and faint decay, the journalists understood the truth. Once gangrene had been named, once the city knew its scent and its silent hunger, nothing could stop its march. The charity ward of St. Bartholomew's Hospital had always been a place of quiet suffering. Narrow beds lined the walls in precise rows, each one a pale testament to poverty, disease, and neglect. The floorboards creaked beneath the nurses' feet, carrying whispers of coughs, moans, and the faint rattle of dying breaths. Candles sputtered weakly in iron sconces, their light struggling against the heavy grey fog that pressed in through the high windows. And now, amidst the usual scent of damp linens and antiseptic, a new aroma had begun to dominate. The sweet, insidious perfume of decay, curling softly through the ward like smoke and settling into the folds of blankets and clothing. The ward was overflowing. Men and women, children and the elderly had arrived in steady procession over the past days, each carrying wounds that refused to heal, limbs that had blackened in quiet surrender, and an air of inevitability that pressed down on the nurses and doctors alike. The small hospital, intended for a modest number of the destitute, now groaned under the weight of the afflicted. Beds were pressed so closely together that visitors could barely pass between them, and the patients themselves filled the narrow space with the faint, sweet odour that had become their calling card. Nurse Agnes moved among them with measured steps, her gloved hands steady despite the tension she felt coiling in her chest. She paused beside a young man whose toes had begun to darken beneath thin socks, fingers curling uselessly around the edge of the bed. He was silent, unmoving, yet his skin seemed to pulse faintly beneath the bandage, as though the disease were breathing through him. "Another one," she whispered softly, not to alarm him, but to remind herself that she had seen this before. The doctor entered shortly after, lantern held high, his expression as grim as any nurse had ever seen. He knelt beside a middle-aged woman whose fingers had begun to peel away at the edges, blackened and curling like charred paper. Her eyes were wide, staring without recognition, the numbness creeping upward along her arm. The doctor's hands moved with careful precision, checking the spread of the rot, noting the faint hiss of gas beneath the skin. "Prepare the instruments," he said quietly. "We cannot save them all, but we may save some. Time is no longer our ally." Agnes nodded, moving quickly to gather the saw, the clamps, the bandages, and the ether. She could hear the soft, eerie hiss rising from the patient's limbs, a chorus of quiet surrender that pressed on her senses like a low wind. The room seemed to grow smaller with every passing moment, the walls leaning in, the smell of sweetness thickening with oppressive insistence. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, muffling the city into silence. Inside, the ward was alive with quiet desperation. Families lingered in the corners, faces pale and tight with worry, hands clenched in silent prayer. Children sat on beds, clutching mothers' skirts, wide-eyed and trembling. The room was a hive of fear and helplessness, yet the disease moved with patience, its reach inevitable. The charity ward, once a place of refuge, had become a chamber of quiet horror. The blackened limbs, the softening flesh, the numbness that betrayed life itself, all were pressed close together, a testament to the disease's relentless advance. Even the strongest among the nurses and doctors felt the weight of inevitability, the knowledge that gangrene did not pause for compassion or skill. As the ether was administered and the first operation began, the sweet perfume of decay pressed thickly against the walls, curling around every corner of the ward. It was a reminder, patient and inexorable, that despite the work of human hands and the skill of surgeons, the disease had claimed dominion over this room, and the overflow of suffering would continue, moving quietly, silently, and mercilessly through every bed, every body, and every breath. In the midst of the chaos that had overtaken the charity ward, one surgeon moved with a determination that set him apart from all others. Dr. Lionel Carraway, tall and austere, had long been a proponent of meticulous cleanliness, insisting that even in the most crowded and dismal conditions, hands must be washed, instruments scrubbed, and linens replaced whenever possible. His colleagues considered him obsessive, perhaps even eccentric. Yet, in the days of gangrene's advance, his methods were a rare beacon of sanity amidst the encroaching madness. The ward was thick with the scents of damp linen, carbolic, and the faintly cloying sweetness of decay. Patients moaned softly from their beds, limbs darkened and softened by the relentless disease. Gas hissed beneath blackened flesh, a faint whisper of what lurked beneath the skin. Even with the antiseptics, the infection moved too quickly, creeping along veins and nerves with patience and cruelty. Yet Dr. Carraway did not falter. "Cleanliness is not a mere affectation," he barked to the assistants, his voice cutting sharply through the gloom. "It is the thin line between life and the insatiable march of death. Wash again, and do it thoroughly. Every instrument, every hand, every surface must be rendered incapable of carrying this silent predator further than it already has. The nurses nodded, their faces pale beneath their caps, hands red from repeated scrubbing in carbolic. Even the ward's ventilation offered little relief. The sweet, insidious odor clung to everything, saturating the air as if the disease itself had infiltrated the walls. Yet under Dr. Carraway's strict oversight, the instruments gleamed and the linens were replaced, and for a brief moment it seemed as if human diligence might forestall some measure of the inevitable. He approached a patient, a young girl whose hand had been blackened to the wrist, the flesh curling back like scorched parchment. The numbness had already claimed her fingers, yet the rot pressed steadily upward, ignoring fever, ignoring pulse, ignoring the faint antiseptic that clung to her bandages. Dr. Carraway examined the wound with steady hands, gloved and careful. He noted the gas pockets beneath the skin, the soft yielding of tissue, the subtle, almost imperceptible movement of decay. "Amputation is necessary," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Yet even this will not save all. Cleanliness is the only defense we have beyond the sore. It slows the spread. It delays the inevitable." The young girl's mother pressed her face to the sheets, silent tears tracing lines through the fabric. Outside, the fog pressed thickly against the windows, muffling the distant sounds of the city. The ward, cramped and overflowing, seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the disease itself, each hiss of gas beneath the skin, each soft sigh, each breath of fear echoing through the chamber. Dr. Carraway moved to the basin, washing his hands again, deliberately, as though each rotation of the brush and rinse of water were a battle against the invisible predator that had claimed so many. "Attention," he said sharply to the assistants. "Do not falter. Every lapse invites the rot to move faster. Remember, the disease respects nothing but opportunity." He returned to the patient, steady and unflinching. The ether was applied, instruments readied, and the amputation began. Even in the act of removal, Dr. Carraway maintained his discipline, ensuring that each stroke, each cut, and each bandage afterward met the highest standard of cleanliness. The ward exhaled with quiet relief, though the air remained thick with the faint, persistent sweetness. For all his skill and rigor, Dr. Carraway understood that gangrene was not merely a matter of dirt or neglect. It was patient, relentless, and merciless. But within the constraints of the infirmary, his insistence on clean hands, scrubbed instruments, and careful vigilance offered the only glimmer of hope that some lives might yet be spared, even as the disease claimed all it could beyond the walls. Outside, fog clung to the streets, pressing in like an uninvited witness. Inside, the surgeon's hands remained steady, gloved, and washed, a bulwark of order against a world of creeping, quiet decay. In the dim light of the infirmary, where candles flickered weakly and shadows draped the walls like mourning cloth, the practice of amputation had assumed a grim prominence. Once a measure of last resort, now it had risen as the only mercy in a world haunted by silent, creeping rot. Limbs blackened, softened, and yielded beneath the patient's skin, and surgeons found themselves forced into swift, decisive action, for hesitation meant the disease would claim more than what could be severed. Dr. Lionel Carraway moved between the beds, his hands gloved and steady, his face drawn with the weight of countless decisions. Each patient bore the marks of the disease, blackened edges curling like burnt parchment, numb fingers or toes, faint hissing of gas beneath the skin, and the pervasive sweetness that clung to the air. It was a scent that pressed against the mind and the heart, a quiet herald of mortality. Amputation was no longer merely a procedure. It had become an act of compassion in its most cruel and necessary form. The surgeon's saw glinted under the candlelight, instruments lined up with meticulous care. Ether hung in the air, pungent and sharp, meant to dull the pain of patients who could no longer feel the true horror beneath their skin. Nurse Agnes prepared the linens and supported the terrified hands of patients who had not yet succumbed entirely to numbness. She whispered prayers under her breath, small comforts in a chamber filled with dread. The families of the afflicted lingered, silent and pale, understanding that the procedure, however brutal, was a chance for life, however diminished, to continue. The young man in bed 7, a dock worker named Edward Langley, had arrived the previous evening with his leg already darkened to mid-calf. The blackness had crept steadily through the night, and despite fever and rising pulse, his body had failed to resist. The limb was soft beneath the skin, gas forming faint pockets that hissed quietly, imperceptible to anyone not listening carefully. Dr. Carraway assessed the leg and gave the solemn nod that had become familiar in these past days. "There is no other way," he said. "Delay will be fatal. The disease advances silently, and this is the only mercy we can offer." Edward swallowed, a faint shiver passing through him, though the numbness had already claimed sensation. His mother pressed a hand to his forehead, silent tears marking the beginning of a grief she could not voice. The doctor applied the ether, and the assistant secured the patient, preparing for the grim work ahead. As the saw touched the blackened tissue, a faint hiss rose from the limb, a whisper of the rot resisting its removal. The surgeon moved with deliberate precision, guided by experience, necessity, and the unyielding rhythm of survival. The blackened flesh peeled away, soft and unresisting, revealing grey muscle that had surrendered entirely to decay. The room was filled with the mingled scents of ether, carbolic, and the faint sweetness of mortality. Outside the windows, the fog clung thickly, muffling the city in a suffocating silence. Inside, the infirmary bore witness to the rise of amputation, not as punishment, but as the only true act of mercy the surgeons could offer. Patients would survive, though forever diminished, carrying the evidence of the disease's cruelty and the surgeon's grim compassion. And in the quiet between operations, the nurses and doctors understood that gangrene, relentless and merciless, could be delayed, perhaps even held at bay, but never wholly defeated. Amputation had risen as the language of mercy in a city overrun by invisible, patient decay, and the sweet, insistent perfume of rot lingered, marking the room and every life touched by it. The widow sat in the corner of the infirmary, her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles white against the rough fabric of her shawl. Candlelight flickered across her lined face, casting long shadows that trembled with each breath she drew. Outside, the fog pressed low over the streets, thick and silent, muffling the distant clang of carts and the faint voices of those unaware of the horror within these walls. Inside, the room smelled of carbolic, ether, and the faintly cloying sweetness of decay that had begun to dominate the ward. Her husband, a man of modest strength and quiet courage, lay upon the narrow bed before her, his right arm blackened from elbow to fingertips. A factory accident had begun, it a minor cut at first, treated hastily, dismissed as trivial. Yet overnight, the rot had claimed the flesh with patient cruelty. The edges had curled, softened, and darkened until the limb was no longer fully part of the living man. Gas hissed faintly beneath the skin, a whisper of death that only the keenest ears could hear. The widow had been summoned only hours earlier, her presence requested by the surgeon. She had arrived, hands trembling, knowing only that the blackened limb was beyond hope. And now, seated in silent vigil, she watched as Dr. Carraway prepared the instruments. The saw lay on the table, polished and gleaming, its edge sharp, cold, and merciless. Clamps and forceps were lined neatly beside it. Ether waited in its glass bottle, pungent and ready to dull the pain that, by now, the patient could no longer feel. The surgeon's hands moved deliberately, checking each instrument, his expression carved from concentration and grim resolve. He glanced once at the widow, his gaze acknowledging the weight of her presence, though the procedure would spare little courtesy to emotion. "You must understand," he murmured quietly, almost to himself, "that this is mercy. Without it, the rot will climb further. Nothing else can halt its advance." The widow pressed a hand to her lips, whispering a silent prayer for courage for herself, for her husband, for the unknown that lay ahead. She could see the blackened flesh curling like burnt paper beneath the linen, the numbness that had claimed the fingers, and the faint, subtle hiss that rose as gas escaped beneath the skin. The sweetness lingered faintly in the air, an invisible witness to the disease's patient, relentless progress. The assistants restrained the patient gently, positioning him as Dr. Carraway applied the ether mask. A faint shiver ran through him as consciousness waned, though the numbness had long claimed the limb. The widow leaned forward, watching the pale face of the man she had loved, tracing the line of the blackened arm, the slow, inevitable march of death beneath the skin. The saw met the flesh with a clean, deliberate stroke, and a faint hiss rose from the blackened limb, a whisper of the rot resisting its removal. The widow flinched involuntarily but remained seated, a silent witness to the merciless procedure. The surgeon moved with practiced precision, slicing through tissue, separating blackened flesh from what remained of muscle that could still hold life. Each motion was methodical, a grim dance of necessity and compassion. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. When the limb was finally removed, the surgeon wrapped the stump carefully, and the widow exhaled a breath she had not realized she had been holding. Her husband's pulse remained faint but steady. He would live, though diminished. The faintly sweet odor lingered, curling in the corners of the room, a reminder that gangrene had claimed its due and that mercy had been wrought through fire and steel. Outside, the fog thickened, pressing against the windows like a silent, watchful presence. Inside, the widow remained in her chair, eyes fixed on her husband's face, understanding fully the cruel paradox. The saw had spared life, yet it had exacted its toll, and the patient who survived would carry the evidence of decay in every pulse, every breath, and every memory. The streets of London had long been thick with the twin spectres of fog and filth, a grey, viscous curtain that pressed against windows and seeped beneath doors. For weeks, the alleys and thoroughfares had been haunted by whispers of disease, the faint sweetness of decay curling into the air from houses marked with chalk crosses. Children avoided the puddles, mothers dragged their skirts higher to escape contact with the grime, and men crossed the street hastily, faces pressed into collars against the invisible threat. Yet over time, a change began to emerge, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. The streets, at last, began to drain. It was not merely water that receded, though rain and runoff found their channels and fell into cleared drains. It was the accumulation of filth, debris, and the invisible incubators of gangrene that had once lurked in every shadow, every corner of the city. Authorities, spurred by the mounting toll of blackened limbs and silent suffering, had begun a campaign of unprecedented rigor. Drains were cleaned, refuse burned or buried, and every alley swept and scrubbed with carbolic and lime. The fog that had once carried the faint sweetness of disease now pressed against surfaces purer than before, though still heavy with the damp cold of winter. Nurse Agnes, moving along Millwright Lane on her rounds, noted the difference immediately. Where the water once pooled in shallow depressions, now it flowed freely along the cobblestones. Where the rats had scuttled in fat, brazen numbers, now they emerged only rarely, and always quickly, as if they sensed the shift in the air. The faint scent of sweetness had not vanished entirely, for rot leaves traces beyond the eye and the nose, but it had lessened a ghost of what it had been. The residents emerged cautiously from their homes, still wary, still watching for the chalk marks that had once been warnings. Children began to play near the edges of the gutters again, though mothers remained close, fingers tight in their skirts. Vendors reopened carts that had been shuttered for days, their wares arranged carefully to avoid contact with damp stones and lingering filth. Even the butcher shops, apothecaries, and laundries began to see movement, their doors opening as though life itself were testing the air. Yet the memory of the disease lingered. For those who had seen blackened fingers and toes, numb limbs and softening flesh, the street's newfound cleanliness was no guarantee of safety. The marks on doors had been erased, but the spectre of gangrene had left its lessons. Vigilance, hygiene, and awareness were now etched into the minds of the living, as surely as the chalk had been etched upon the wood. The doctor, returning from his rounds, walked the cleared streets with a measured pace, observing the change. He noted families tending to their homes, washing steps and doorways, and securing refuse so that no stagnant water would form. The subtle sweet scent still lingered faintly in corners where the rot had once taken hold, but it no longer permeated the air, no longer pressing against lungs and nerves with oppressive insistence. For the first time in weeks, the city breathed differently. The drains carried away the standing water, the muck, the hidden pathogens that had allowed disease to flourish. The fog remained, pressing against the cobblestones and the brick walls, but it no longer bore the same insidious weight. Still, the infirmary remained full, the echoes of suffering and the toll of blackened limbs a reminder of what had come before. The streets had been cleared, the water drained, and the alleys scrubbed, but the city knew that gangrene, though temporarily stalled, was patient and relentless. It could return in silence, waiting for the smallest opportunity to claim its next victim. And so the people walked cautiously among the cleared streets, feeling, at last, the fragile comfort of movement, while knowing that vigilance and the memory of the sweetness in the air would always be necessary to survive the quiet, merciless shadow that had once stalked them. The infirmaries of London were alive with motion long before dawn, though the fog pressed against the windows as if to hold the city in quiet judgment. In every ward, the clatter of instruments, the low murmur of nurses, and the soft footfalls of doctors moving from bed to bed created a rhythm both methodical and tense. The invisible enemy gangrene had claimed countless victims in recent weeks, spreading silently, patient and unrelenting. And yet, within these crowded, dimly lit rooms, a quiet resistance took shape. The doctors moved like shadows of hope, their hands precise, their minds alert, and their wills honed by necessity. Dr. Lionel Carraway, tall and deliberate, made his rounds with a lantern held high, illuminating the faces of patients pale with fear, fever, or exhaustion. His eyes lingered on the blackened edges of hands and feet, on the subtle puffiness of softening tissue, and on the faint, whispering hiss of gas rising beneath the skin. Each case was a study in patience and horror, a small wound that had grown beyond comprehension, a leg that had turned cold overnight, a hand that refused to respond. Beside him, Nurse Agnes moved with quiet efficiency, her gloved hands steady as she prepared the ether, adjusted bandages, and soothed trembling patients. She understood the patterns now, the numbness, the slow peeling of flesh, the faint, cloying sweetness that pervaded the air. She had witnessed the black line crawling upward along an arm, the softening of tissue that resisted every attempt at intervention. And yet, the doctors continued, undeterred, fighting a foe that could not be seen and yet could be measured in the hollow pulse of their patients' limbs. In Ward 5, a young boy with a blackened toe lay on a narrow bed, his mother pressed beside him, eyes wide with fear. Dr. Carraway knelt beside the child, inspecting the wound carefully. "The rot has claimed the tissue beneath the skin," he murmured. "We must act swiftly to remove it before it climbs further. Delay will be fatal." The mother's lips trembled. Can it be saved?" "Only by the saw," Dr. Carraway replied, his voice low, precise. "And even then, life comes at a cost. The disease moves silently, faster than fever, faster than the pulse. It does not pause for comfort or prayer." Elsewhere, Another doctor worked above a patient whose forearm had been blackened to mid-elbow. Instruments gleamed faintly beneath candlelight, the saw poised to sever what the disease had already claimed. Ether hissed from the mask, mingling with the sweetness of decay that rose from beneath the bandages. The patient's body shivered in anticipation, though the limb itself had long since surrendered sensation. All across the infirmary, the same ritual unfolded: precision, patience, and grim determination. Each doctor understood the merciless calculus: remove the limb, save the life. Delay, and the disease would outpace every effort. The faint hissing of gas beneath the skin, the soft bubbling of decayed tissue, the subtle sweetness in the air, these were constant companions, reminders of what they fought against. By mid-morning, exhausted hands had cleaned, bandaged, and removed, leaving behind patients diminished but alive. The doctors paused briefly, their faces pale beneath the lantern light, observing the work they had wrought. They understood that their victory was partial, temporary, and costly. Gangrene did not retreat. It waited, patient, in alleys, workshops, and homes, ready to claim its next limb. Outside, the city remained shrouded in fog, streets wet and glistening with the residue of winter rain. Within, the infirmary breathed quietly, each nurse and doctor aware of the invisible enemy that had already claimed so much, yet resolute in the knowledge that vigilance, skill, and relentless care were the only defenses against its silent, merciless advance. And so the doctors fought, methodical and unflinching, against the disease that refused to be seen, leaving behind a faint perfume of decay and the quiet echo of lives preserved by the edge of the saw. The infirmary was unnervingly quiet that morning. The only sounds, the faint hiss of gas beneath blackened flesh, the low groan of fevered patients, and the whisper of footsteps on worn floorboards. The fog outside pressed thickly against the tall windows, curling around the stone walls like an uninvited guest, pressing inward with a chill that carried both damp and dread. Inside, Dr. Lionel Carraway prepared for an operation unlike any he had conducted in years. The last amputation without anesthetic, a grim echo of an older, harsher age, yet necessitated by circumstance, time, and the insidious advance of gangrene. The patient, a middle-aged man named Richard Hale, had arrived the previous evening with a wound that had begun as a minor laceration to the forearm. Within hours, the edges had blackened, softened, and curled inward. Numbness had claimed the fingers entirely, yet the subtle hiss of gas beneath the skin whispered of the disease's relentless, silent movement. By dawn, the rot had climbed to mid-elbow, leaving no time for modern anesthetic or careful preparation. Carraway's hands were steady, though his face bore the weight of what he must do. The instruments lay neatly on the polished tray: saw, clamps, forceps, bandages, each gleaming under the flickering candlelight. Nurse Agnes stood nearby, her gloved hands pressed tightly together, eyes flicking from the blackened limb to the patient's face. Hale's expression was pale, lips pressed together, but eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resignation. "Steady now," Carraway murmured, kneeling beside the bed. "This will be brief, though harsh. There is no time to delay." The patient's breath came in shallow gasps. I understand," he whispered. "Do it quickly." Carraway nodded, tightening his grip on the saw. He could hear the subtle hiss of gas beneath the soft, blackened flesh, a whisper of the disease asserting its dominion. The skin had become pliant, almost gelatinous, and the edges had begun to peel away, as if anticipating the surgeon's blade. With deliberate precision, he pressed the saw against the limb, holding it steady while assistants secured the patient's other arm. The first stroke was met with soft resistance, a faint tearing of softened tissue that produced a sound almost imperceptible in the hush of the ward. Carraway moved with careful, rhythmic force, cutting through the infected flesh, while monitoring the patient's pulse and shallow breath. Nurse Agnes gripped the patient's hand, murmuring prayers under her breath as the subtle, sweet scent of decay intensified, curling around the room and pressing against the candle flames. The limb yielded slowly, blackened tissue separating from the living muscle beneath. The hiss beneath the skin grew louder, punctuating the silence of the room with its quiet, ghostly presence. Minutes stretched into an eternity as Caraway continued, each precise movement a battle against both the disease and the limitations imposed by the absence of anesthetic. The patient did not cry, though his body trembled in reaction to the procedure. The numbness had claimed sensation, but not the terror of witnessing one's own flesh being severed from life. When the final cut was made and the limb removed, Caraway wrapped the stump carefully, dabbing at the faintly bubbling tissue and securing bandages as quickly as prudence would allow. The sweet scent of decay lingered, thick and insistent, yet the operation was complete. Hale's pulse remained faint but steady. He would survive, diminished yet alive. Outside, the fog pressed closer, muffling the city in silence. Inside, the ward exhaled quietly, though the subtle hiss of gas beneath other blackened limbs continued, a reminder that the disease did not sleep. Caraway wiped his hands carefully, glancing at the remaining patients, all marked by the slow, deliberate mercy of the saw. The last amputation without anesthetic had been performed, and though life remained, the ward was forever imprinted by the quiet cruelty of Gangrene, its sweet scent lingering like a ghost in the corners of the infirmary. By the final days of winter, the streets of London had grown quieter, the fog pressing low over the alleys and thoroughfares like a shroud. Yet beneath the apparent calm lingered a scent that refused to be ignored, a faint, insidious sweetness, the perfume of gangrene, drifting invisibly through the air. It had haunted homes, workhouses, hospitals, and apothecaries alike, leaving a trace of fear in every corner it touched. Even as sanitation improved, drains were cleared, and the streets began to drain, the memory of that odor clung stubbornly to the minds and noses of the living, an echo of the countless victims who had succumbed to its patient, relentless advance. In the charity wards, the faint scent still lingered, mingling with the sharper aroma of carbolic, clean linens and the occasional tang of ether. Nurses and doctors moved among the patients, with practiced precision, attending to the weak and the suffering, adjusting bandages, administering medication, and preparing for the inevitable amputations that might save life at the expense of limb. Each step, each motion, carried the weight of vigilance and fear. The disease had taught them lessons no textbook could convey. The blackening of flesh was silent, the numbness deceptive, and the sweet perfume unavoidable. Outside, London moved through its fog, oblivious to the horrors that had once stalked its alleys. Merchants swept their doorways, children played near the edges of cleared drains, and carts rattled along streets, now scrubbed of the filth that had once nurtured the rot. Yet those who had witnessed the spread of gangrene knew differently. The disease had left an indelible mark not only in the limbs it had claimed, but in the collective memory of the city. Mothers whispered to children to keep their wounds clean. Fathers inspected their hands and feet for darkened edges, and midwives and apothecaries reminded their patients that vigilance, cleanliness, and speed were the only defenses. Even in homes untouched by infection, the faintest hint of the smell lingered, carried on coats, skirts, or the shoes of those who had ventured into affected areas. It was a ghostly presence, subtle yet unmistakable, a reminder of the invisible predator that had crept through the city with patience and cruelty. Families spoke of it quietly, trading stories of chalk-marked doors, blackened limbs, numb fingers, and the soft hiss of gas beneath skin. These tales became warnings, lessons passed from neighbour to neighbour, ensuring that London would never forget the terror that had claimed so many. The surgeons, too, carried the memory. Even after wards were emptied of the most critical cases, after amputations had been performed and the worst of the rot removed, the sweet smell haunted their hands, their clothes, and the sterile spaces they moved through. They had fought tirelessly against an enemy that could not be seen, heard, or easily stopped. Every successful operation, every life spared, had been purchased at a steep cost, the body diminished, the mind scarred by the quiet horror witnessed. And so the city lived on, cautious and wary, marked by a disease that had walked silently among its citizens. The fog may have lifted in some alleys, drains may have carried away stagnant water, and the streets may have begun to drain, but the smell remained in memory, in whisper, in warning. Gangrene had been patient. It had been relentless. It had been merciless. And though the city rebuilt, cleaned, and persisted, the faint, sweet perfume, the smell that haunted Britain, lingered still, a spectral reminder that the quietest threats often left the deepest scars.